Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. I recognize the Premier.
Here. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce to you and through you to all members of this Assembly, Dr. Wilf Keller. Currently, Wilf is the President and CEO of Ag West Bio. Mr. Speaker, I also take note that Wilf is from the community of Melville, which I had said in the back wasn't important, and the member from Melville Saltcoats reassured me that it was of the utmost importance, Mr. Speaker. But Wilf previously had been awarded the 2015 Saskatchewan Order of Merit and was inducted into the 2017 Saskatchewan Agriculture Hall of Fame. And today we want to take the opportunity to congratulate Wilf on his induction into the 2018 Canadian Agriculture Hall of Fame. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to please join me in welcoming Dr. Wilf Keller to his Legislative Assembly. Mr. Speaker, while I'm on my feet, I also want to add to the introduction Dr. Bob Tyler. Dr. Bob Tyler is the current chair of the Agri-Food Council and is the chair of the Ag West Bio Board of Directors, as well as being a professor at the Great College of Agriculture, Mr. Speaker, at the University of Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to please join me in welcoming Dr. Bob Tyler to his Legislative Assembly. And last but not least, Mr. Speaker, while on my feet, I would like to introduce someone that I believe needs no introduction in this Assembly, Mr. Rob Norris, Mr. Speaker. He was elected, as we know, as an MLA with the Saskatchewan Party in 2007 in the constituency then of Saskatoon-Greystone, and he served in this Assembly until 2016. He spent many evenings in here and in committee exercising the vastness of his vocabulary and stretching the limits of Hansard's abilities, Mr. Speaker, that we can all remember fondly and possibly not so fondly, Mr. Speaker. But currently Rob is serving as a senior strategist in the office of the Vice President of Research at the University of Saskatchewan, and I Mr. Speaker, ask all members to please join me in welcoming Mr. Rob Norris and all of our guests to their Legislative Assembly.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the Premier in welcoming Dr. Keller and Dr. Tyler and, of course, Mr. Norris to their legislature, and to recognize the contributions to agriculture, to research, to science, to our higher learning as a whole, and thank you for that service, and ask members to join me in welcoming and thanking Drs. Tyler and Keller and Rob to their legislature. And while I'm on my feet, I'd like to recognize Mr. Marc Masson, is the Communications Director for the Assemblée communautaire françaiscoise. C'est un des leaders de la communauté francophone ici en Saskatchewan. Il est dans la galerie opposée. Je suis vraiment content de le voir ici, and happy to welcome Mark to his legislature and ask others to join me in welcoming him to our house today.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to welcome a number of individuals seated in your gallery today. Carolyn Bagnall, Executive Director, Mechanical Contractors Association of Saskatchewan out of Saskatoon. Ryan Tyning, Chair of Prompt Payment Saskatchewan with Swift Plumbing and Heating out of Swift Current. Jason Duke, past Chair of the Saskatchewan Construction Association and owner of CertaPro Paint in Regina. John Lax, Director of Advocacy and Communications with the Saskatchewan Construction Association, and of course Mark Cooper, President and CEO with the Saskatchewan Construction Association. Mr. Speaker, our government is proud to have a great working relationship with the Saskatchewan Construction Association. We look forward to continuing their great work and sharing with them. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to be asking all of the members to join with me. While I'm on my feet, I'd also like to join in the previous introduction of the members in your gallery, in particular my former seatmate Rob Norris. I remember well being schooled on vocabulary and how to be articulate. But I do remember one day in particular where we were answering a question that could have been answered by either one of us, and we both stood up at exactly the same time. It wasn't a matter of who's on first. We were right there in the middle, and the Premier had the look on his face when he looked at us that melted both of us. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask you and all members to join with me in welcoming these members to the Assembly today.
I recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to join with the Minister to welcome these leaders to their Assembly. Welcome to Ryan, to Carolyn, to Jason Duke here, to Mark Cooper and John Lax. Thank you for your leadership within Saskatchewan as it relates to our construction industry. And thank you to these members as well for being involved in the very important work to bring together prompt payment legislation that will work for Saskatchewan. I know this has been important to these members within Saskatchewan for some period of time, and I understand legislation is going to be introduced here today. We look forward to that and making sure that that legislation serves this very important industry within our province. So I ask all of us to join in the welcome of these important people to their Assembly.
I recognize the Minister of Parks, Culture and Sport.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce some important folks from the Chris Knox Foundation. Joining us is Director Kim Folk, no stranger to this Assembly, is here along with Sheldon and Chelsea Mitchell, who came down from Prince Albert this morning. All members will, most members will know the tradition of the Chris Knox Foundation. Started in 2007. A young man in Regina wanted to go to the Grey Cup. He's had some trouble with his health. The community came together and was able to get to the Grey Cup that year. Good result for getting 10 kids down to the Grey Cup to experience that. Unfortunately, Chris lost his battle shortly after that. A foundation was, in memory of Chris, was put together with the goal of helping children and young adults attend sporting, fine arts, and cultural events during treatment, giving them a reprieve and some wonderful memories with family. And that tradition has continued along, and it does today. So I want to thank the people, Harvard Broadcasting and CKRM here in Regina, who are sending Chelsea and her father Sheldon to the 106th Grey Cup this weekend. Mr. Speaker, they had a chance to talk to them earlier. They are big Rider fans. They wish the green and white was playing like we all do, but I know they'll enjoy their time. They're big football fans. So please join me in thanking Kim from the Chris Knox Foundation, all the great work they do here in our province, and we wish Sheldon and Chelsea a great weekend. Thanks.
I recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the official opposition, it's an honour to join in the welcome of these leaders within the Chris Knox Foundation here in our province, here in our Assembly here today. Thank you so very much for allowing Chris's legacy to live on in the lives and rich experiences that are being extended to so many within our community all across our province. And we're just so thankful for that work, and our heart goes out to all those that are dealing with some challenges that we can only imagine. Thank you for making some of their dreams come true.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, to you and through you to this Assembly, I'd like to introduce a couple of guests in the West Gallery, Mr. Speaker, from Ovarian Cancer Canada. We have Ann Chase and Marilyn Williams, if you'd give us a wave, please. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Rural and Remote Health and myself had the opportunity to meet with Ann and Marilyn and a number of other delegates from Ovarian Cancer Canada this morning. We had a great meeting, Mr. Speaker. We look forward to some follow-up discussions with them as well. I'd like to take this opportunity to ask all members to please welcome them to their Legislative Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join in with the Minister opposite in welcoming our guests today from Ovarian Cancer Canada, including Ann Chase, who has been a strong advocate within Saskatchewan here. We had the opportunity as well to meet with some advocates yesterday. Looking forward to hearing more about what comes forward on this front, and I want to thank these individuals for their advocacy and also welcome them to their Legislative Assembly today.
I recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to join with members of the Assembly in welcoming representatives from the construction sector. They're here today, Jason, John, Mark, Carolyn, and Ryan, to their Assembly, and I want to thank them for the work that they're doing for the people of Saskatchewan, especially with respect to advocating for the construction sector, Mr. Speaker. I'd also like to take a moment just to thank Mark Cooper from the Saskatchewan Construction Association and the Association, Mr. Speaker, for the work that they're doing and helping supporting the work that we're doing at Priority Saskatchewan. The Construction Association, Mr. Speaker, is a key stakeholder when it comes to the work that we're doing at Priority Saskatchewan and at SaskBuilds, and they've been involved from the beginning. So I really wanted to express my appreciation to Mark and his association for the work that they're doing in terms of helping us bring the best opportunities to Saskatchewan businesses. Okay. Mr. Speaker, while I'm on my feet, I wanted to introduce a gentleman who is well known to this Assembly in the West Gallery. Ian Hanna is here, Mr. Speaker, from the STF. And I want to just express my appreciation to Ian. He's been a good conduit between my office and the executive of the STF, Mr. Speaker, and helping maintain that relationship, Mr. Speaker, as we build a relationship in this sector. So I want to just appreciate his help and his assistance and conversations that we've been having over the last number of months, Mr. Speaker. So I'd ask all members of the Assembly to welcome Ian to his Assembly.
I recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the Minister in welcoming Mr. Ian Hanna to his Legislative Assembly. Ian is the Director of Government and Stakeholder Relations with the STF, as has been mentioned, a position that he assumed about, I think, just over a year ago. And I just wanted to thank him for the creative and effective ways he's been able to bring the voice of students and teachers and advocate for the whole of the publicly funded education system in the province and raise the profile there. So on behalf of the official opposition, I wish to thank him to his Legislative Assembly and invite all members to do so.
I recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's indeed my pleasure to once again rise in this Assembly to introduce a great group of grade 10 students from Yorkton Regional High School, my old high school from Yorkton, Saskatchewan, in the West Gallery, Mr. Speaker. We have 37 grade 10 students. They're always very well prepared when they come here. Mr. Perry Ostapowicz, their teacher, really informs them and teaches them as to the happenings of this building, Mr. Speaker. Along with them is an intern, Marla Thompson. I understand Pat Rollick is driving the bus again. I don't see him up there. He tends to stay outside and look after the bus, but he's up there as well, Mr. Speaker. And as is customary with this group, they tend to send me little bits of contact, and then I'll recognize them in the Assembly. So with this group is Michael Speary, son of Barb and Jeff Speary, who I know very well from Yorkton, Kelsey McLaughlin, Maddox Statistician, that's Christine Curtis's son, I know them very well, also Jermaine DeJesus, and Elizabeth Ridley. But Mr. Speaker, also with them is, I'm not going to date him too much, but he's my old shop teacher, Mr. Don Tachik, who, although his youthful experience, he did teach me a lot of what I know about mechanics and automotive, and he's a great teacher. He's been guiding kids for a lot of years. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to welcome them to their Legislative Assembly.
I recognize the member for Prince Albert, Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to join with the Minister and welcome Sheldon and Chelsea Mitchell to their Legislative Assembly. Mr. Speaker, Sheldon's wife and Chelsea's mom, Shelley, plays on our slow pitch team. And so we've had a lot of fun with our slow pitch team. We're all family. And Sheldon took a little bit of a break with playing ball, but he's come and joined us on some of our tournaments, which is a lot of fun. And because we're a big family, Mr. Speaker, when Chelsea was fighting her battle with cancer, it affected us all, and we supported them, and we will always, you know, and so I'm happy to see them here. I'm excited for your trip to Edmonton. I know a few of our ball members are going to be going there as well, so hopefully you get a chance to see them. And I want everybody here to welcome them to their Legislative Assembly. Thank you.
Presenting petitions. I recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to present a petition to get big money out of Saskatchewan politics. And the undersigned residents of the province of Saskatchewan want to bring to our attention the following: that Saskatchewan's outdated Election Act allows corporations, unions, and individuals, even those living outside this province, to make unlimited donations to our province's political parties. And we know that people of Saskatchewan deserve to live in a fair province where all voices are equal and money can't influence politics. But we know that over the past 10 years, the Sask Party has received $12.61 million in corporate donations, and of that, $2.87 million came from companies outside Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan politics should belong to Saskatchewan people. And we know that the federal government and the provinces of Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and now British Columbia have moved to limit this influence and level the playing field by banning corporate and union donations to political parties. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the government of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party to overhaul Saskatchewan's campaign finance laws, to end out-of-province donations, to put a ban on donations from corporations and unions, and to put a donation limit on individual donations. Mr. Speaker, the people signing this petition today come from the city of Moose Jaw. I do so present. Thank you.
You're here.
Recognize the Minister of Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose a carbon tax on the province of Saskatchewan. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action: to cause the government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by citizens of Regina. I do so present.
I recognize the member from Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to stand in my place today to present a petition as it pertains to dialysis services for northwestern Saskatchewan, and that there are a growing number of individuals living with kidney failure, and there's a disproportionate burden amongst those in northwestern Saskatchewan communities. That technicians to run the equipment could be trained, creating more work in the area, and nurses from the locality could be trained to run the dialysis unit. Mr. Speaker, that access to health services is one of the key 12 determinants of health incomes. A satellite dialysis unit in the area would help create optimal health outcomes while minimizing healthcare costs and the financial burden to patients. So the prayer reads as follows, Mr. Speaker: to cause the provincial government to provide the public funding to set up a satellite unit in northwestern Saskatchewan to provide hemodialysis treatment that is closer proximity to many patients' homes. This would greatly lessen the burden of out-of-pocket costs for the people from this area who are undergoing kidney dialysis. This would allow northwestern people with kidney failure to live where they want to live and not have to be forced to move in order to stay alive. And the people that have signed this petition and the many other pages of petition that we have presented, Mr. Speaker, are primarily from the Losh, and I so present.
Here, here, here. I recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to present a petition in support of in-house security services at Saskatchewan healthcare facilities. These citizens wish to bring to our attention that the Government of Saskatchewan's Security Services Review and the Saskatchewan Health Authority appears to be driven by a desire to contract out and cut costs rather than improving safety in healthcare, and that frontline workers have the solutions to address increased violence and safety concerns in public healthcare, more in-house staff, proper equipment and training, and improved incident reporting and follow-up, and that safe, quality healthcare means having an adequately staffed, properly trained and equipped in-house security team, not cutting jobs and contracting out to the lowest private bidder. I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the government to commit to maintaining quality, publicly funded, publicly delivered, and publicly administered security services. The citizens signing this petition come from Frobisher, Regina Beach, and Saskatoon. I do so present.
I recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition to restore public control over Wascana Park. The citizens who signed this petition today wish to bring to our attention the following. Wascana Park is a treasured urban park and conservation area that had been responsibly managed through an equal partnership between the City of Regina, the province, and the University of Regina for more than 50 years. The government unilaterally gave itself majority control of the board of the Provincial Capital Commission through the changes brought on by Bill 50 in 2017. And the City of Regina and the University of Regina have both expressed an openness to return to a governance model based on equality. I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the government to restore the governance structure of the Wascana Centre Authority and end the commercialization of Wascana Park. Mr. Speaker, the signatories to this petition today come from Regina. More specifically, they come from the constituencies of Rochdale and Regina University. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise once again today to present petitions on behalf of concerned citizens, businesses, workers all across our province as it relates to the expansion and imposition of the PST and the hike to the PST and then placement upon construction labour within our province. Of course, this is the epitome of a job-killing tax, Mr. Speaker, at a time where we need jobs, at a time where we need investment, Mr. Speaker, and the impact is hurting businesses all across our province and impacting people by way of the jobs that they deserve. Job loss for far too many, Mr. Speaker. The prayer reads as follows. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to stop saddling families and businesses with the costs of their mismanagement and immediately reinstate the PST exemption on construction and stop hurting Saskatchewan businesses and families. These petitions today are signed by concerned residents of Regina and Saskatoon. I so submit.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. I recognize the member for Kenora Pelly.
Today, we in this Assembly gathered together to light the candle to mark the 85th anniversary of the genocide of the Ukrainian people, Holodomor. The ties between our province and Ukrainian are strong, and so it makes sense that we were the first jurisdiction in North America to recognize the man-made famine devastated to Ukraine. Holodomor means death by hunger in Ukraine. Pain and suffering was orchestrated by Joseph Stalin in the early 1930s as he imposed a man-made famine which killed up to 10 million people in 1932 and 33. The Soviet government sharply increased Ukraine's grain production quotas, making it nearly impossible to fulfill the unrealistically high grain targets, resulting in a widespread starvation. The Ukrainian borders were closed off as the hunger grew, depriving people from access to food from other regions in the Soviet Union. Mr. Speaker, it is important for the people in Saskatchewan and around the world to reflect on this dark page in history. We must honor both victims of Holodomor and the survivors by ensuring that this genocide is never forgotten. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members of this Assembly to join me in remembering the tragic events as we reflect on the 85th anniversary of Holodomor. Vichnia Pomni.
Recognize the member for Regina Northeast.
Mr. Speaker, it's with pleasure that I rise today to celebrate an important week for my constituency, the City of Regina, and our province's agricultural sector, agribition. Agriculture is one of the pillars of our province's economy and history, which is acknowledged by the provincial symbol of the wheat sheaf. The Western Canadian agribition has been a fixture in the calendars of people across Saskatchewan for almost half a century. it provides Saskatchewan producers and innovators an opportunity to show the world our excellence in agriculture. Agribition attracts roughly 160,000 visitors from over 86 countries, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to join the Leader of the Opposition, the member for Regina-Rosemont, and the member from Regina-Lakeview in attending Agribition later today. We'll be taking in the blend of agriculture and First Nations, shopping, food, and entertainment. And I have no doubt that this year's Western Canadian Agribition will once again be the world-class event that exhibitors and guests have grown to expect. Our province has been a leader in agricultural innovation, and I know that our producers will continue our long history of success and lead the world in technology, crop science, and stock breeding for many years to come. I hope that all members will join me in congratulating the organizers and volunteers for what will surely be another successful Agribition. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Westview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, our government announced the expansion of our Early Learning Intensive Support Pilot for pre-kindergarten students in Saskatchewan. This program provides new pre-kindergarten spaces for children with intensive needs in Regina and Saskatoon. This means hiring additional educational assistants trained to support these children. Children with intensive needs include those assessed as having a capacity to learn that is compromised by various cognitive, social, emotional, behavioral, or physical conditions. These children require additional support to ensure they establish a strong learning foundation for the rest of their educational career. This pilot program began this spring with 12 children, and we now provide nearly 90 child care spaces for children with intensive needs. Programs like these have a very real effect on families in our province. As a parent of a student in the pilot program put it best when she said, "The ELIST program, while just in its infancy, has meant a lot to our family. It gives our son, who has autism, a place to learn and grow." They continue to say, "We look forward to watching our son grow and learn in his own special way. The ELIST program has given us back some hope." Mr. Speaker, by ensuring the future generation begins their education in the best way, we can ensure a better future for Saskatchewan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the summer, my constituency had a terrific athlete compete in the Special Olympics Canada Summer Games, and I would like to take this time to recognize his success. Tyler Tassani is an amazing athlete from northern Saskatchewan. He brought home two silver medals for Team Saskatchewan from July 31st to August the 4th. He won these medals in the long jump and in the 400-meter race. Tyler is fluent in Dene and is coached by Kelly Halukowicz from La Ronge. He has a great support network from his home community of Wollaston Lake. Tyler is a great teammate, citizen and role model for youth across the North.
Hear, hear.
He set personal bests in all his events he competed in. The Special Olympics Canada Summer Games is a national sport event which competitive athletes with intellectual disabilities, each athlete must qualify at the local and provincial level before coming to the national games. There were over 3,000 spectators that watched the games, in addition to over 900 athletes, 290 coaches, officials, and mission staff, and 600 volunteers. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to congratulate Tyler on his successful summer. We wish him the best in his future as an athlete. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Melfort.
Mr. Speaker, today Rita Fennell from Melfort is celebrating her 111th birthday. She's the oldest citizen in our province, and though some across the way think that that title belongs to our Justice Minister, Grandma Deet is confirmed the oldest citizen in Saskatchewan. For perspective, she's lived through 2 world wars and the Great Depression, and when I asked her for one piece of advice to pass on to the province, she simply said, to slow down and live life. She also mentioned that taking out your teeth to clean them is helpful. Mr. Speaker, she is going to be in the Guinness Book of World Records as the world's oldest volunteer, and last year at 110, she took her turn manning the Salvation Army kettle at our Melfort Co-op. She's proud of her large family, who visit her often. And Mr. Speaker, when I asked her what was the best decision she ever made in her life, without hesitation, she said it was marrying Albert, the love of her life. And so there is one piece of information from Grandma Deet that I regret to pass on to the rest of us, and that's that when I asked her what's the key to long life, she told me that she doesn't drink coffee. And, so, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Premier and the rest of the Legislative Assembly, I'd like to recognize Grandma Deet on her special day.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, November 17th to the 25th, marks the 44th Annual Saskatchewan Multicultural Week. This week is meant to celebrate the rich and growing cultural diversities of the people in this province. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan was the first province to pass multicultural legislation recognizing the right of every community to retain its identity, language, and traditional arts and sciences for the mutual benefit of our citizens. Multiculturalism brings many solid economic benefits to our province and contributes to a high quality of life. In fact, diversity helped build this strong and dynamic province, Mr. Speaker, and it continues to be our strength as we work together to create an even brighter future. Mr. Speaker, our province continues to grow. People from all over the world are coming to Saskatchewan and sharing their unique cultures and traditions. They bring with them fresh ideas, a determination to succeed, and a sense of the possibilities Saskatchewan has to offer. I would like to recognize the Multicultural Council of Saskatchewan for their work developing and promoting multicultural values across our province. Their tireless efforts help make us better as a society. I invite everyone to join me in celebrating Saskatchewan Multicultural Week 2018. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Batoche.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thanks to advocacy done by the Birdies Ogomasses Cree Nation, as well as the Martin Family Initiative, the Chief Birdies Memorial Elementary School has been chosen to be part of the Model School Literacy Project. Only 6 schools across Canada have been selected to be part of the program since 2016. This project will provide the absolute best quality education to First Nations schools across Canada, ensuring that reading and writing levels for early years are a top priority. Mr. Speaker, the project has seen great success in graduation and retention levels through early learning education. The elementary school has been stressing the importance of education and what it means for the future generations for a long time, making them very deserving of this recognition and acceptance into the program. The school truly values literacy, numeracy, treaty language, and culture, and this program will enhance understanding and grade levels in all areas. Mr. Speaker, I now ask that all members please join me in congratulating the elementary school as well as the Birdies Ogomasses Cree Nation and the Martin Family Initiative for their hard work in winning the Model School Project Literacy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker. So let me get this straight, Mr. Speaker. Loblaws gets subsidized buses. We use them as cover for the failing GTH project, but we can't know how much they paid for the land. We spent $2 billion on a bypass, and we can't know how much of that money went out of province companies. Government employees have been taking fancy trips on the dime of vendors, and we can't see the investigation into that scandal. And now Nutrien has a tax incentive for head office jobs. Or maybe I should say job, since it appears there's only one. A head office they're required to have here by legislation, and we're not allowed to know just how much we're paying them to have that one position here. This is all getting a bit rich, Mr. Speaker. When will the Premier practice some transparency? When will he level with Saskatchewan people? How much are we paying as a tax credit to Nutrien so they can have head office jobs in Calgary?
Hear, hear, hear. I recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker. With respect to Nutrien and their operations here in the province of Saskatchewan, it's over 4,000 jobs, Mr. Speaker. They have over 4,000 employees in the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. They have moved a number of employees into the province as they have increased operations, Mr. Speaker, both on the mining side as well as moving jobs into the province on the retail side, Mr. Speaker, moving Nutrien Ag Solutions into the city of Regina, up about 30% in their jobs in the city of Saskatoon, Mr. Speaker. This is an industry that is important to the core of the source wealth of our province, Mr. Speaker, and it's an industry that through the head office tax credit that we have had, Mr. Speaker, and through the incentives that we have had in the industry, Mr. Speaker, has experienced some $20 billion worth of investment over the last decade. Mr. Speaker, this is an industry where Saskatchewan is truly a global leader. Notwithstanding all of that, Mr. Speaker, we share the concerns, and I've been in touch with Nutrien, as I said, Mr. Speaker, regarding the head office presence and the presence of executives in this province, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the legislation that is there. Mr. Speaker, we expect that legislation to be abided by, and we look forward to meeting with the board chair at our earliest opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to get an update on what our head office operations are here in the province and what they will be.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, the question was, how much are we paying in that tax incentive to have head office jobs here? And the answer is not available, it appears. Is the Premier really saying that the people of Saskatchewan don't have the right to know how much of our money we're giving to this company for head office jobs that don't even appear to be here?
Hear, hear, hear.
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we are not going to discuss the tax returns of Saskatchewan-based companies, Mr. Speaker, on the floor of the legislature or in the public domain, Mr. Speaker. We most certainly are not going to do that, Mr. Speaker, so we can ask all we like with respect to the member's opposite question, but we won't be discussing tax returns on the floor of the legislature. What we will discuss, Mr. Speaker, are the jobs in the industry, the potash industry most notably, Mr. Speaker, but all of the industries that we have here in the province of Saskatchewan. Again, this is an industry that has experienced unprecedented investment, Mr. Speaker, in expanding the operation of the production opportunities for existing mines here in the province. And in the first time in decades, Mr. Speaker, we are seeing investment into new mines in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, new mines that have recently opened and will open in the future. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan most certainly is a global leader in the potash industry, and we intend to keep it that way.
Hear, hear. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we're talking about the people's money. By what measure should we not be allowed to discuss that in the People's Assembly? Mr. Speaker, this fall, the Office of Francophone Affairs was moved from Executive Council, where portfolios with intergovernmental importance tend to be housed, only to be buried in parks, culture, and sport, a move seen as insulting by Francophone leaders and as moving the needs of the Francescois further away from the attention of this government. This move echoes the decision of Doug Ford to eliminate Ontario's French language commissioner and is part of a troubling trend of this Premier of cozying up to Ford for photo ops but advancing a similar agenda. Mr. Speaker, Doug Ford has interfered in municipal elections in Ontario. This Premier has messed with our municipal elections, leaving only 2 weeks between our provincial election and elections in our cities and towns. Ford has frozen minimum wage in Ontario on the eve of it reaching $15 an hour in 2019. Our minimum wage is frozen in time and won't reach $15 until 2012. Ford is sneaking back in cash for access and big corporate dollars. In Saskatchewan, they've been here all along. Mr. Speaker, what other pieces of Ford's agenda will we see replicated here? What does the Premier have to say to the Francophones of Saskatchewan about his decision to bury their representation in another ministry?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, difficult to know where to even start, Mr. Speaker, with that essentially what is a member statement, Mr. Speaker.
Pretty well.
Mr. Speaker, let me start with this. This province's commitment to all of the people in the province, Mr. Speaker, whether that be the Francois community, Mr. Speaker, whether that be any of the individuals, rural, urban, and First Nations community in this province, Mr. Speaker, it will always be this government that engages and stands up for the beliefs and for the things that are important to the people of the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to ensure that we can support industries, Mr. Speaker, to have the opportunity to expand their investment in this province and expand the jobs, Mr. Speaker, so that we can continue to increase our population here in the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. And with those jobs, Mr. Speaker, comes the opportunity for people to move here from around the world and that next generation, Mr. Speaker, to have a job in a community, possibly where they were raised in Saskatchewan. That's something that hasn't always been available in this province. But, Mr. Speaker, as long as we're able to continue to engage with the people and represent the people in this province, Mr. Speaker, it'll be the opportunity that we hope to have for years to come in Saskatchewan.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, I'm sure the irony is lost on no one that the Premier complained about the length of my question and then went on to talk about nothing related at length. So we'll simplify the question a little bit for the Premier this time. Why the decision to move the Francophone Affairs from Executive Council over to be buried in Parks, Culture and Sport, a decision that has sent a very strong message that this is not an important file for this government?
Recognize the Minister of Parks, Culture and Sport.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're on this side of the Assembly, we're very proud of the Ministry of Parks, Culture and Sport. They do good work in our province, Mr. Speaker. It's just not accurate that it was buried, Mr. Speaker. This I think aligns well with what we do in parks, culture and sport. This is an approach taken similarly right across Canada, Mr. Speaker. The mandate doesn't change, staffing levels doesn't change, the budget doesn't change with Francophone Affairs, Mr. Speaker. So it's status quo going forward, Mr. Speaker. If there are concerns on behalf of the folks in Francophone Affairs, we'll certainly meet with them and sit down with them and hopefully alleviate any concerns they may have.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That was a very good description of why this has insulted the representative of Canada's official languages here in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, today is National Child Day. And there's another decision that's been made by the Ford government in Ontario, and that's the elimination of their Child Advocate Office, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to know, as we look at the importance of that role, how important that is for this government, the crucial role that the Child Advocate's Office plays in defending children in difficult circumstances. Now, Mr. Speaker, here in Saskatchewan, that's a serious issue. We have now over 5,000 children in care. Over 80% of those children are First Nations or Métis. Now, Mr. Speaker, this Premier wouldn't even cross the street to talk to people who are raising this issue, wouldn't have the dignity to sit down and hear from those who are affected the most. Mr. Speaker, over 600... There's some news I think we should have the members across listen to. As we've discovered that in the last 5 years, an increasing number of children, babies I should say, over 600 in the last 5 years, have been removed from their families before they reach the age of 30 days. That's risen from 100 in 2013 to 148, an increase of 43% in just 5 years, Mr. Speaker. Will the Premier commit to keeping the Child Advocate Office intact, and will he explain to us why are newborn apprehensions rising in Saskatchewan?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And for the member opposite to say we don't have a working relationship with the Children's Advocate is just absolutely ridiculous, Mr. Speaker. I was able to participate with an event, in an event with the member opposite where the Children's Advocate actually did a walk around Saskatoon for those that of children in care, Mr. Speaker. And I was glad that the Leader of the Opposition was able to join us at least for part of that walk at the beginning, Mr. Speaker. But we walked the whole journey. As far as children in care, Mr. Speaker, we have a very good record of working with our First Nations communities on children in care. We have 11 homes that are actually operated by the First Nations communities. We have over 150 children that the First Nations communities are actually working with us and implementing our programs with their children, Mr. Speaker, as opposed to the members opposite when they were in government. And I'll ask the Leader of the Opposition to talk to his colleagues when they had 21 children in one foster home, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The work of the Child Advocate's Office is extremely important. That's why it's so worrying to see the friend of this government decide to eliminate that in Ontario, and we hope they won't go down that road here, Mr. Speaker. This is a story that I saw far too often while I worked as a family doctor. Parents who accepted a new child into their life, were welcoming a new child, but were struggling in poverty. And instead of helping to lift that family out of poverty, what do? We lift the child out of the family, Mr. Speaker. It's devastating for those parents and devastating for that baby in those crucial weeks of bonding. Those first few days and months are so important. Manitoba has taken action, reducing the number of newborn apprehensions in each of the last 3 years. Well done. We're moving in the opposite direction. More kids in care. 42% of them are newborns in the last 5 years. Why is this government taking babies away from their mothers? And what's the plan to stop the apprehensions?
I recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I'll reiterate for the member opposite, we have several programs to be able to keep families together, Mr. Speaker. It is not social services policies to just go in and apprehend children, Mr. Speaker. We only do that on the extreme circumstances. We have in-home supports with families, Mr. Speaker, where we actually provide caseworkers to go in and work with the family, work with the parents, work with the child to be able to do that. And when that's not, we offer a person of sufficient interest, Mr. Speaker, which is a person that is close by to that family member that can take custody of that child on a temporary basis. Mr. Speaker, we also have positive parenting programs, and we have various other amount of programs that we implement to be able to make sure that those children can stay in their home, Mr. Speaker. They can stay in contact with their community and with their culture. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, in the midst of all those programs, we've seen the numbers increase from 100 in 2013 to nearly 150 today. What's going on? Why haven't those improved? We didn't hear any answer on that. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Premier's been sending mixed messages when it comes to vendor-sponsored junkets in e-health. First he said it was just fine. It was just fine in some circumstances, and then he changed his mind. And now he wants us to believe that it's never okay. Never okay, and that there hasn't been a single instance of vendor-sponsored travel in the last 10 years. We know that's not the case. We know it's not limited to e-health, as this kind of travel wasn't even against Saskatoon Health Region policy, Mr. Speaker. The Premier also wants us to let him off the hook when it comes into the investigations into what was going on at e-health, brushing accountability aside because these were personnel matters. Well, Mr. Speaker, we're not buying it. We know that 2 distinct investigations took place, and the first led to the firings. The second investigation delved further, and according to what the Minister said in the House yesterday, concluded that the contracts resulting from these junkets were just fine. There was no influence from that travel. Well, Mr. Speaker, we want to see the proof. There's no reason to withhold the value for money review of the contracts with companies that paid for luxury trips for e-health employees. Will the Premier do the right thing? Will he act in the name of transparency? Will he share that report?
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I clearly indicated yesterday, the legal work that was done by an outside legal firm, Mr. Speaker, on the e-health situation, senior officials advised me that those are HR matters and those aren't typically released, Mr. Speaker. I clearly stated that yesterday. Mr. Speaker, as far as the member opposite's point, well, the member doesn't want to listen. The man who is going to do politics differently heckles more than anyone, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as far as transparency, the Premier's made it very clear he's asked his Deputy Minister to review vendor-sponsored travel across government. Mr. Speaker, we're going to give him time to do that review, and we'll deal with it in due course. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Mr. Speaker, last week we asked the government for answers about the problems with the Regina bypass, and we didn't get any. But we did get our first glimpse into the thinking that allowed this project to turn into the largest overrun in the history of Saskatchewan, ballooning from $400 million to more than $2 billion. When I asked how much it cost to fix the major deficiencies with the Regina bypass, the former minister said, quote, "I don't know what the cost of that was for us to fix because we don't care." And then he tried to slough it off by, it's right here in Hansard, Mr. Speaker. Then he tried to slough it off by saying the partners paid for it. Well, I do have a news flash for the former minister. Saskatchewan people are the ones who pay the partners, and Saskatchewan people are the ones on the hook to pay for the next 30 years. So, can the minister tell us what all the deficiencies with the bypass are and how much they cost to fix? Because I can assure her that the people of Saskatchewan do care.
I recognize the Minister of Highways.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just to clarify up front, this project is on budget and on time. Mr. Speaker, no section of road is opened on the bypass project until it has undergone an evaluation by the Highway Safety Auditor as well as our ministry's own safety evaluation. If a major deficiency had occurred, that portion of the bypass would not be opened until the problem had been fixed. If a major deficiency is found, it is the responsibility of the contractor to fix it, and they do not get paid for those items until they do, which are included in the original price. Fortunately, there have been no major deficiencies, and nearly all of the minor deficiencies have been fixed, Mr. Speaker. What is important to note is that safety is a factor for this project, and it has been brought to our province. SGI data reported 123 collisions on Highway 1 east of Regina in 2013. Since this has opened this year, only 29 accidents have taken place, a 75% reduction. Thank you.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Mr. Speaker, I find it very interesting that this government chose to redact the list of major deficiencies in the response to our FOI. Saskatchewan people are the ones paying for the bypass, and they deserve transparency when it comes to problems with construction. They deserve answers when it comes to these deficiencies, and they deserve answers when it comes to costs now and into the future. That transparency is something that the people of our province are entitled to, and it doesn't make them entitled. The people of Balgonie were inundated with truck traffic because of the failed design of the bypass, and that only counted as a minor deficiency, which begs the question, how bad do things need to get to count as a major deficiency? Will the minister table the list of the current list of major deficiencies with the Regina bypass today?
Recognize the Minister of Highways.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Regina bypass is the largest infrastructure project in Saskatchewan history. Over 100 Saskatchewan companies have helped make this project a success. Mr. Speaker, no section of road is opened on the bypass until it has undergone, as I've already stated, an evaluation by the Highway Safety Auditor as well as the Ministry of Highways' own safety evaluation. All of this is to ensure safety on our roadway. There are no major deficiencies on this bypass. There were some minor deficiencies, and those are being worked through by the Regina bypass team. Some examples of some minor deficiencies might be something like landscaping or mismatched paint. Mr. Speaker, because of the P3 agreement, 2 times the estimated value of deficiencies are withheld from the contract until these are fixed, Mr. Speaker. And this, Mr. Speaker, is not uncommon for a project of this size. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I asked about the impact of the Sask Party government's cuts to education, and specifically about the government's refusal to fund preschools for high-needs children. After the 2017 budget, when preschools were on the chopping block due to the minister's $54 million cut from classrooms, the minister told reporters that he would not let those programs end because he wants Saskatchewan to be the best place in the world for people with disabilities. Well, Mr. Speaker, he signed off on those cuts anyway, and these families were left with a lot of questions and uncertainties moving forward. Will the minister commit that his government will step in and fund the programming for high-needs preschoolers once the federal money runs out?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, it's interesting that this question gets asked, Mr. Speaker, on a morning when we announced the early learning supports to child with intensive needs, Mr. Speaker. An announcement that we made right here in the City of Regina, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, through the Canada-Saskatchewan Early Learning Childcare Program, Mr. Speaker, $51 million has been available to provide supports, Mr. Speaker, to provide more childcare spaces, Mr. Speaker, including, Mr. Speaker, $82,000 for deaf and hard of hearing and early childhood pilots, Mr. Speaker. 2 pilot projects, Mr. Speaker, one in the City of Regina and one in the City of Saskatoon, Mr. Speaker. We're going to evaluate these programs, but we know, Mr. Speaker, that providing these services to children, especially, Mr. Speaker, especially in very early years, Mr. Speaker, is the key to ensuring that they will be successful in their educational journey, Mr. Speaker. So we're going to continue to provide these supports, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to reach out, Mr. Speaker, to our partners in the sector to make sure that we're providing the right supports, especially for early years, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, there is no coincidence that I'm asking these questions today. It's to remind people why those programs have to be reintroduced as pilots in the first place. Mr. Speaker, while some families are understandably relieved that they've been offered a spot in pilot programs, we know that this only partially undoes the government's damaging cuts to supports for early learners. As one mother said, quote, "If they hadn't shut down all the special needs preschools in the first place, we wouldn't be in this situation." Mr. Speaker, families were left waiting, losing months of needed support, while this government waited for federal dollars. Parents and boards of education have been fighting for their children, but the Minister of Education has been letting these children down for over a year. Will the minister stop making excuses and act? Will he commit today that the provincial program will step up and agree to provide funding for this program once the federal money runs out?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Speaker, I have stood in this House on a number of occasions, Mr. Speaker, and I've spoken about this government's support for early years education, Mr. Speaker. It's important to ensure that children that are coming up through the school system, especially preschoolers, Mr. Speaker, are provided the right opportunities so that they can be as successful as they can in their learning journey, Mr. Speaker. The money that we've got from the federal government has been able to provide us with some significant support, Mr. Speaker. We've expanded childcare spaces, not just with the federal money that we receive, Mr. Speaker, but across the piece. We've significantly increased childcare spaces, Mr. Speaker, preschool spaces, Mr. Speaker. So we'll continue to work with our school divisions, Mr. Speaker, and our partners in education to make sure that we provide the right supports to the children that need them in those classrooms.
Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The North has been devastated by the cuts from this government and, of course, the downturn in the mining activity. Hundreds of workers have been laid off from the uranium mines, and the Sask Party closed the Buffalo Narrows Correctional Center, killing more jobs then. And now the Sask Party's cuts to education have also killed jobs in the North. Now we're learning that the Sask Party has cancelled supports for the Saskatchewan cooperative fisheries. Fishing is one of the few things we have left and offer hope for the North, and the Sask Party is pulling support for that too. When things are already so hard for families in northern Saskatchewan, it just doesn't make any sense to be cutting any more supports for the North. And yet they did. $50,000 isn't a lot of money for the government, but it goes a long ways in supporting jobs in this very important industry. How can the Sask Party government justify cutting this support from northern fishers?
Recognize the Minister of the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as the member will know, prior to 2012, all commercial fish in Saskatchewan were sold through the Freshwater Fish Marketing Corporation. Due to commercial fishing cooperatives wanting access to a free market, the province of Saskatchewan withdrew from that organization in 2012. This change also removed royalties that were associated with the sales, thus eliminating funding that was coming to the provincial government. In order to facilitate that transition, both the Ministries of Economy and Environment provided reduced amount of funding to the cooperative over the last number of years. We signaled our intent to withdraw that over a number of years, and over the past several years, the Ministry of Economy provided us some funding, minimal funding, about $2,500 annually, but we had already notified and signaled that we would be completely withdrawing that funding, and we carried through with that, Mr. Speaker. I was pleased to see in the news article, Mr. Speaker, that the PA Grand Council and the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan have stepped up and have provided some funding for meetings to take place, Mr. Speaker, and that's probably the most appropriate way for these organizations to proceed with their meetings.
Hear, hear. Hear.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills.
Item number 1, Honourable Mr. Morgan.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 152, the Builders Lien Prompt Payment Amendment Act 2018, be now introduced and read a first time.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 152 be now introduced and read a first time. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next sitting of the House.
Next sitting. Presenting reports by standing in special committees. Orders of the day.
Written questions. Question number 7, asked by Mr. Forbes.
I recognize the Government Whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to order the answer to question number 7.
Order for question number 7.
Question number 8, asked by Mr. Forbes.
I recognize the Government Whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to table the answer to question number 8.
Table for question number 8.
Question number 9, asked by Mr. Forbes.
I recognize the Government Whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to order the answer to question number 9.
Order for question number 9.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 5, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 133, the Legislative Assembly Election Dates Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Witherspoon.
I recognize the member for Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To join in on Bill number 133, the Legislative Assembly Election Date Amendment Act 2018. I guess the government obviously introducing some legislation here. On our side of the House, we were wondering exactly who did they consult with and how, what was the response they got from municipalities, local school boards about changing the date that would affect their outcome when the government had an opportunity, to amend the legislation and to change the date. Different dates might have been suggested from different organizations. I don't know who all would have suggested those dates, but it's interesting. The government had an opportunity, and not to give themselves an extra 6 months of the election to call a general election. They had an opportunity and could have had an opportunity to say, you know what, let's have it sometime in June of 2020 instead of going to October 26th as they're changing the legislation to October 26, 2020. That causing a bump. They've moved up now the municipal election and the boards of education election by, I believe there's a difference of 2 weeks is what it is. I believe it's November the 9th, 2020 for local school boards and for or boards of education and municipal elections. Now, the government could have decided and taken suggestions, and there's still time to fix this. It hasn't been passed. The government could say, you know what, in light of suggestions we've heard all over, taking suggestions from members on this side, other individuals, that giving time, 2 weeks isn't enough time between a provincial and our local elections. That might cause a lot of problem in different areas, Saskatchewan elections, a lot of work that they have, the resources, the work, they're doubling up, and that may, and sometimes they're the same individuals who work as returning officers, work organizing and doing what they can to make sure elections run smoothly and the services that are supposed to be provided are provided. The government could have had an opportunity, as I said, to change the date and go with a date of like June 2020, so that there was to be about a 6 month between the election of the boards of education before local municipal elections and a provincial election. It would have been 6 months. They could have given some opportunity for everyone to get their ducks in a row to make sure everything's on it, and give those individuals who do the good work of making sure our elections move smoothly, and to make sure we follow what we need to follow when running elections. And there are those individuals, like I said earlier, who do volunteer, and some get compensation, some do it for different reasons, that they feel the passion and they want to get involved. So having said that, and some of those individuals maybe want to run for office in different ways. Maybe they want to run for an MLA, they want to run for the mayor, they want to run for school division. I guess the choice is theirs. But sometimes when you have an opportunity for them, that distance where you're not cramping it in, and in 2 weeks we're going to have boards of education, as I said, we're going to have local school board. Now, they could, and like I said, there is an opportunity for the government to say, well, maybe we don't have to pass this legislation of October 26th. We can pick a date in June. We know the farmers are done seeding. There's an opportunity. The kids are still in school. There is an opportunity here. They're not on summer break. I think, as a suggestion, June of 2020 would be a good date, and maybe the government could consider that in light, as I said, giving the time that, that they've had. So having said that, I know my colleagues and stuff, we have more to say, and I'm wondering sometimes how that process worked, how the government picked the date that they did, October 26th, when it was, and to bump up the municipal election and cause some grief. And I haven't heard from all the mayors and council and boards of education. Given we want to reach out, and I'm hoping the government did their due diligence and should have done their due diligence and checked with those municipalities, those mayors and councils, and we know there's a lot of them. They serve, and do a great job. Many of them, put a lot of time in. They're passionate about representing the residents that they serve, whether it's boards of education, local school boards. So there's an opportunity for the government to say, you know what, we've talked with individuals, we can amend this, we can set the date for June of 2020 rather than 2 weeks where, like I said, we'll have this election. So right now, and we've seen how the government talked about fixed election dates, and we see how that really has not worked well for them, but they really wanted to push that. That was part of their whole campaign, and they campaigned hard on that. That's what they were going to do. There'd be fixed election dates. Well, we see that hasn't worked very well for them for whatever reasons, but here's an opportunity where they could take a suggestion and go June of 2020, but obviously we'll see at the end of the day whether this gets passed or the government says, you know what, we can amend it, we can change it, and we can look at that. So at this point, I know my colleagues will have more to say, and we'll have work to do in committee that we can discuss this, and I think we can go out and consult with those individuals that might be impacted, and I hope the government does its due diligence and make sure they check with them. So at this point, Mr. Speaker, I have no further comments. I'm ready to adjourn on Bill 133. Thank you.
Members move to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Item 2, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 134, the Local Government Election Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Chartier.
I recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy today to join with some discussion with regards to Bill number 134, the Local Government Election Amendment Act. Mr. Speaker, this has been something that I've been really particularly interested in. At one time, I was a returning officer for 8 years for Prince Albert North Coast. So it gave me a really good opportunity to learn a lot more about the Election Act and all the things that are involved with making sure elections are run smoothly and efficiently. Mr. Speaker, and looking through those lens of a person who was at one time responsible for ensuring that the elections would run smoothly, I feel that having this Local Government Election Amendment Act, where the provincial election will be October 26, 2020, and the municipal election November 9, 2020 is a bit of a nightmare, I would say. I know, coming from a smaller community, some of the challenges we had as a returning officer was to find people to work the election, and oftentimes we used individuals who had worked municipal elections or federal elections because they obviously have an interest and are a little bit trained, although it's a little bit different when you're working those different elections, but some of the principles are the same. So oftentimes we would go to those avenues to look for workers. And I know a lot of the people who worked those elections, some of them are on pensions, and so they're only able to earn so much. And so that was another issue that they would be concerned about, of how much they were able to earn and if that was going to interfere with what they would be eligible for. And so I'm worried and concerned that with having these election dates so close together, if that might impact the amount of people who would be able to work these elections, and if they are able to work those many days in a row, because we know oftentimes we're looking for people to work the advance polls. We have to have them come in for training. Then they work a 12-hour day for election day, which is oftentimes a very long day and difficult for some individuals. And so if we're looking for that, also municipal governments are going to be looking for those individuals, and we're oftentimes going to be seeking out the same people who are able to do that. So that's going to be a bit of a challenge. Another challenge that I suspect will be is renting facilities. I know that was another issue with regards to looking for facilities that would be readily available for us to host our election day, and oftentimes those facilities in my smaller community anyway are schools or some of the city-run halls. And so I don't know how this is going to work for schools if they're going to be wanting to shut down all of their facilities for student use for 2 full days within a 2-week period on election day. So that's going to be something that needs to be looked into as well. And I know the original reason why this has come about, Mr. Speaker, is because before there was only 5 days separating the provincial election and the municipal election, and a lot of individuals were concerned about that not being enough time between the elections for multiple reasons. But I don't think people who are bringing up this as an issue thought 14 days was way better. Like 5 days, 14 days, I can't see that being too much of a difference with regards to having elections in close in the time frame. And so another thing I think of when I'm thinking in my returning officer mind frame is advance polls. Mr. Speaker, I don't know if that was considered when these dates were considered, but oftentimes advance polls, I don't know if the advance poll for the municipal election will run into or affect the provincial election, or how close they're going to have to be in order to ensure that that could be run on a municipal front. So we got to look at how that might have an impact on the election calendar, and also the other thing I had a concern about too was I know the Premier said that that this would still give us time to have a fall session. Well, we know that the next election there's going to be a lot of turnover potentially in government, and so there'll be a lot of new members, and so my understanding is that you have to have the final count in order to officially declare all of the individuals who ran for the election to say that it is good. And I believe that's 10 days after Election Day. And so after we have the final count, and then we can all be sworn in. That is my understanding. So then that puts us basically close to mid-November. So I don't know. It's going to be really hard to have a fall session after that and before Christmas. So that's going to interfere with the duties of this House. Also with municipal elections, a lot of municipalities, they establish their budgets in the fall, and they're in budget deliberation. And so if their elections are November 9th of 2020, or I believe it was November 14th of 2024, was kind of the thought process, the Wednesdays after that. If that's going to give them enough time to establish their budget, and we saw at after the last municipal election, there was a big turnover in a lot of municipalities, and so when you have relatively new councils, I know that was a challenge for a lot of the municipalities after the last election, was with having new council members trying to figure out what their role is, but then all of a sudden being thrown into having to work on budget deliberations. So that presents quite a bit of a challenge. So I think that needs to be addressed as well. And we also need to realize that even if we have a lot of the same workers working those two elections, like I said, although the procedures are a bit similar, but there are some differences. So if you're training all these workers around the same time, there could be a bit of confusion there, which we don't want to have any issues on Election Day because it's so fast-paced, and so we want to make sure our workers are properly trained. Also, for voters, this is very confusing. I could see in our communities, we're going to have signs up for provincial candidates, signs up for municipal candidates, signs up for school board candidates, and so this is going to provide a lot of confusion for voters on who's running for what and when. And we already know that the last municipal election, the voter turnout was extremely low, and because the municipal election will only be 2 weeks after the provincial election, I would hate to see voter turnout even get any lower than what we had. And so I'm concerned about that. Another issue, Mr. Speaker, is that in our communities, we don't have a whole lot of people who are running to run for politics. So it's often a challenge to find candidates wanting to assume these roles. And so we're encouraging people to run provincially, federally, municipally, and also for our school boards. And so sometimes some individuals who might not have been successful, say provincially, might consider running in a municipal election or go on the school board, or they might also be individuals who are currently a municipal official or a school board elected official, and they might consider running for provincial politics, but they might have to then give up their spot in what they're representing already, and if they're not successful, then we lose them for 4 years, you know, and so one thing that we've been suggesting is having the election come June of 2020, then that gives us a substantial amount of months between the elections, and then maybe that would give some people more time to prepare, and it gives the voters a little bit of breathing room as well. So it's going to be pretty much mayhem in our communities with signs and all over the place, and also volunteers, Mr. Speaker. I know you're probably quite aware that we all expect, we all rely on a lot of volunteers to help run a successful campaign, and that's not just us. Municipal representatives rely on volunteers to help them run a successful campaign. School board electees also rely on volunteers to help them run a successful campaign. And there's only so many volunteers out there. So this is going to provide a challenge for people to find volunteers to help them with their campaigns. So as candidates, this is going to be an issue. And also when I talked about places to rent for polling stations, I know places to rent for just having campaign offices is a challenge. And so this is going to present as an issue for individuals, candidates looking for places to rent for their campaign offices as well. So again, I hope we don't have voter confusion, and I hope we don't have low voter turnout due to this. And so a few other things that I wanted to say, Mr. Speaker, is that it seems like there was some discussion with stakeholders with regards to this, but we also have some of these individual stakeholders coming out saying that they're not happy with this decision as well, you know, and so there was some discussion, but was that considered? So some people are saying, why don't we just go for the same day then? If we're just going to be 2 weeks apart, why don't we just do it all the same day, hoping to gather a lot of voters to come out. Voter turnout maybe will be good, but I think that again too is confusing for voters as well. So we have a federal election fall of next year, and then why are we trying to push all the other elections in a 2-week span in 1 year? It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to me. So So I think, Mr. Speaker, I know my colleague that's responsible for providing representation with regards at committee with regards to this bill. She will do her research and we'll discuss with stakeholders with regards to the issues or the concerns being brought forward with regards to the changes with this bill. And so with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to adjourn debate on Bill number 134.
Members move to adjourn debate. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion.
Adjourn debates, resume item number 3. Resume debate in the second reading the motion on Bill number 135, the Local Government Election Consequential Amendments Act 2018. Ms. Chartier.
I recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'm happy to provide some of my remarks with regards to Bill number 135, the Local Government Election Consequential Amendments Act. There's not a whole lot that's too different with this. This is a small portion of the bill, and so I put a lot of my remarks with regards to my concerns with the changes of these bills on Bill number 134. And so I just wanted to add a little bit with regards to this bill is requiring that a criminal record check be part of the nomination process with regards to individuals running for municipal government or for school board. And so I think that is good, but with regards to some discussions I had when I was the former critic of municipal relations, when I was in committee with the minister, was that it was brought forward to my attention from some municipalities about some issues with regards to ensuring that members who ran, especially for municipal elections, were in good standing with regards to the municipality. And so we know that there were some people who ran for municipal positions that owed the municipality substantial amounts of money or were in arrears. And so this was brought to my attention, and I asked if the minister had considered to put that within the Local Government Election Act, that it would be a requirement that candidates be in good standing, and I did not. They said they would consider it, and when they made some amendments to the bill, they would potentially put that forward, and I did not see that being implemented within this bill. And so I think that that's very important to consider, especially when we're doing some amendments to bills. This is the great opportunity for us to take some of the recommendations that we've gotten and add that to some of the amendments. So other than that, a lot of the changes are housekeeping in nature and are kind of related to the previous bill, Bill number 134. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to adjourn debate on Bill number 135, the Local Government Election Consequential Amendments Act. Thank you.
Members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 135. It's a pleasure to assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 6, resume debate and second reading motion on Bill number 136, the Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Act 2018. Ms. Mowat.
I recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to enter into the debate around Bill 136, and I thank my honourable colleagues across the way for their applause, Mr. Speaker. I think it's really important to note that when you talk about apprenticeship and trade, Mr. Speaker, I noticed that many of them were apprenticed under the Conservative banner of Stephen Harper, and they have not yet been certified as a full-blown Conservative, but I'm sure that they're very close to that, Mr. Speaker. I would point out, Mr. Speaker, when you talk about the building trades in general in the province of Saskatchewan, they come from a fine tradition, Mr. Speaker. We have had an enormous positive relationship with the building trades of our province over the years, and we understand the process that you've got to have some really good mentors in this particular game of construction. I shouldn't call it a game, Mr. Speaker, but just for the purpose of trying to illustrate our perception on it, Mr. Speaker, we know it's a very serious business, and a lot of the people that are involved with the sub-trades and the construction industry themselves are, in no question about it, are very well qualified and very good champions of their industry. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, they want to share their wealth, their experience, and their knowledge of their particular trade and bring younger people in. Younger people, they appreciate that younger people have younger families, they're starting new and fresh. So it's an incredible industry in itself, Mr. Speaker, as you see what the building trades have done, not only for their industry and for themselves, but to encourage younger people from coming forward to learn their skills from them and to carry on that tradition of providing top quality construction services on behalf of the Saskatchewan people. Again, it's a very, very important and proud industry of our province. So, Mr. Speaker, as you look at how we could be all-encompassing in terms of our effort to try and apprentice as many of these young workers as we can, it's important to know that although there's a school component in many of the building trades efforts to get involved with this industry, there's also got to be hands-on experience. There's got to be coaching on the job. These are really important aspects of how the whole notion around apprenticeship should work. And I'm pleased to see that the government is continuing to have good consultation with them. I think it's important because if you don't have that consultation Mr. Speaker, then you're going to see some of the concerns being expressed by the industry themselves. So it is better to have those consultations. I understand that the industry itself has a few concerns around the act itself, and we want to hear a bit more about that. There's discussion around some of the standards being watered down. Is that an issue? We need to find that out. Is there less of an onus on having specialty services being afforded the right amount of time to really teach a young person and really apprentice young people that may be getting in this particular industry? We need to know the effects of this legislation as it pertains to the construction industry of our province as a whole, but more so with the building trades that operate throughout our province. So, Mr. Speaker, there's a lot to learn here. There's been some definition changes. There's been a replacement of an act of 1999. It talks about a procedure for training of apprenticeship. It regulates the system of apprenticeship. It adds two new categories that were not included in the mandatory training in the previous bill, sub-trade and occupation. We need to know what each of the changes in these additional categories mean and how we can incorporate those new categories into the overall construction industry and how it may impact positively or not positively. We need to know those issues. It talks about mandatory certification trade and certification only trade. And, Mr. Speaker, finally, the bill introduces additional measures to enforce the previous regulation for employers who do not comply. All in all, Mr. Speaker, to point out, when it comes to the apprenticeship program, we must always respect the stakeholders in our province. We must consult with them. We must keep those doors and lines of communication open at all times, because this is their industry, and they can teach not only the young apprenticeship coming forward that may want to enter their particular industry, but they can also teach government on how the system could work. And that's the important point I would finish off on, Mr. Speaker, is that they can indeed teach government how to do these things better. And it's on that note that I would caution all people, when you look at some of the changes being proposed with government, it has to be lock and step with industry. It has to be industry driven. They have to know exactly what is being proposed that affects their industry. And this is where sometimes, Mr. Speaker, most times, we are certainly not satisfied that the Saskatchewan Party government is paying attention to some of their demands and some of their needs. So on that note, Mr. Speaker, we're going to have more or greater discussion on this and what the impact of this bill might be. We're going to have consultation with the appropriate stakeholders, and we want to make sure that we continue on building that proud tradition that Saskatchewan is well known in creating a solid workforce, a workforce that is certainly qualified, experienced, and dedicated to their profession. If we have that on a continual basis, if we portray their ability to the rest of the country, then and only then, Mr. Speaker, can they really truly know what Saskatchewan can do when it comes to the building trades support. So I would again point out, we need more information on this particular bill. We want to see what the effects are, the impacts are, and we'll consult with the appropriate people. So at this point in time, I would move that we adjourn debate on Bill 136, the Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Act 2018.
Members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 136. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 7, resume debate in the second reading motion on Bill number 137, the Sask Energy Miscellaneous Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Pedersen.
Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as I pointed out on numerous occasions in the Assembly, any time that we are dealing with the Crown corporations of Saskatchewan, the official opposition is paying a lot of attention to what the Sask Party is certainly trying to do. And one of this particular bill that we're looking at, Bill 137, it's an act to amend the Sask Energy Act, Mr. Speaker. And right away, the defensive instincts in the NDP start coming up anytime that the Saskatchewan Party talk about amending any of the Crown Corporation's legislation. And I go back to the earlier statement that we made, as we noticed over the years that they have sold off the land titles operation, Information Services Corporation, that was generating $14 million a year profit for the Saskatchewan people. Well, they sold that off, Mr. Speaker. And now you look at the SLGA stores that were sold after, that were creating millions of dollars in profits for the people of Saskatchewan to use in healthcare and education, infrastructure, the list goes on. Well, they've since sold that off as well. And Mr. Speaker, with the recent sell-off of STC's assets and the closure of the Saskatchewan Transportation Company, it's no wonder that the people of Saskatchewan, especially the opposition, have zero trust when it comes to the Saskatchewan Party, when it comes to the Saskatchewan Party trying to portray to people that they're protecting our crowns when they are not, Mr. Speaker. So as I look at this particular bill, an act to amend the Sask Energy Act 2018, there's several significant changes here, Mr. Speaker, to talk about consent to distribute and transport gas. The other part that's quite concerning, Mr. Speaker, is that you look at Sask Energy themselves, raises the debt limit from $1.7 billion to $2.5 billion. Now, Mr. Speaker, that's $800 million more that they're allowing Sask Energy to go into debt. And the question we're going to ask is, what is that debt all about? What is the debt purpose? And we need to find out exactly what the plan is for that additional debt. Now, we've noticed this trend before, Mr. Speaker, where we've seen the Sask Party trying to sell off the crowns, privatize the crowns, and they do it in the dead of night, Mr. Speaker. You know, and this is one of the reasons why we have no trust whatsoever of the Saskatchewan Party when it comes to protecting our crowns. And one of the things we noticed, that, Mr. Speaker, is that this particular party sure loves debt. They sure love debt, Mr. Speaker. As you look at the history of how they've racked up the debt since 2007, it is an astronomical amount. By the end of the 2020 election cycle, Mr. Speaker, this province would have a debt over $20 billion. Mr. Speaker, when we left office, our debt was under $10 billion, and we left them money in the bank. So the bottom line is that the Saskatchewan Party obviously has trouble managing our money. Secondly, can't help but going into deficits. So it comes to protecting the crowns, and we see that they're asking to have the crowns borrow more money. Of course, the opposition is going to get up and ask questions, why and how are you going to use the money? And I'm afraid on many occasions, Mr. Speaker, that their objective is not as genuine as they profess it to be, that really, at the end of the day, not only is our province going to be saddled with debt, I fear that our Crown corporations may be saddled with debt as well, and that's, of course, compliments of the mismanagement, scandal, and waste of the Saskatchewan Party government. So we need to find out what the purpose of this additional debt is, what are the objectives of this debt, and, Mr. Speaker, unless we do, we're not going to stop and stop challenging the Saskatchewan Party on this. We're going to continue to demand answers. We're going to continue standing up for the people that want to see our crowns protected, Mr. Speaker. And all we see the Saskatchewan Party sitting down when it comes to protecting our crowns, and that is a crying shame. So on that note, Mr. Speaker, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 137, an act to amend the Sask Energy Act 2018.
Members move to adjourn debate with Bill number 137. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion.
Agreed.
Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 4, resume debate in the second reading motion on Bill number 138, the Miscellaneous Statute Government Relations Enforcement Measures Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Beck.
Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Bill 138, the Miscellaneous Statutes Government Relations Enforcement Measures Amendment Act 2018. What this particular bill is all about, Mr. Speaker, for those that may be tuning in, it really gives the relevant commissioner or authority power to issue compliance orders for things like amusement rides, boilers, electrical licensing, fire safety, gas licensing, elevators, technical safety, and building codes. Now, Mr. Speaker, we need to talk about what that means. A lot of people in the province of Saskatchewan, in some way, shape, or form, are going to be impacted by some of the notions around compliance for things of electrical nature, or fire safety, or gas licensing. These are all part and parcel of being safe in the public, and everything from elevators to technical safety and following building codes. These are things that people in the province of Saskatchewan assume that we're doing now. Now, one of the things that I'm going to focus on a bit as a result of this particular bill is when we talk about compliance around amusement rides. A lot of people, as you know, Mr. Speaker, they go to many community fairs and many community events and big city events, and of course there's amusement rides there as well. And it's nice to be able to know that there are inspectors out there, that there are compliance processes to ensure public safety. I think a lot of people in the province of Saskatchewan support that. I think a lot of people in the province of Saskatchewan expect that, Mr. Speaker. So it's really an important bill that we pay a lot of attention to from the opposition perspective, because if we have questions that are asked of us, we want to be able to give them a specific response when it comes to the legislation of safety of the public. Now, Mr. Speaker, we all know that many of these large buildings have boiler systems. I understand that there is indeed a very rigorous process to be certified to operate boilers safely. As I mentioned, gas and electrical licensing. And one of the things that I noted when I was part of the government of Lauren Calvert, that at times you'd go into an elevator and you'd see the minister's name on the wall of the elevator, and that was one of the certificate of operations, and they'd have the various ministers' names on some of the elevator walls. And I always used to tell my grandkids, one of these days that'll be my name on that elevator wall. But I noticed over time that the changes that took effect, that it was no longer a minister's name on the document on the elevator wall, that it was actually an official. And it actually did make me feel a bit better in the fact that there was people that had the appropriate background and history, that were familiar with the industry, that they were now in the process of issuing some of the compliance documents and the licensing and the authority to operate even things like elevators. So, Mr. Speaker, whether it's safety and compliance and amusement rides, safety and compliance on elevators, to ensuring that boiler systems are properly operated, electrical systems are properly functioning, these are really important, an important part of what society expects. We have to have a good, robust process to make sure that there is compliance and that there is authority to operate some of this activity. And that's why it's important that we keep finding ways in which we could improve legislation. And all in all, again, with the underlying theme that we must consult with the stakeholders, we must consult with the appropriate agencies that are involved with this particular issues that the bill is trying to cover. And we must always keep an open door policy to keep the communication flowing back and forth to make sure we do a good job of compliance. So on that note, Mr. Speaker, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 138, the Miscellaneous Statutes, Government Relation Enforcement Measures Amendment Act 2018.
Members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 138. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 8, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 139, the Foreign Workers Recruitment and Immigration Services Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Pedersen.
Recognize the member for Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To join in on Bill 139, the Foreign Worker Recruitment and Immigration Services Amendment Act 2018. I know a number of my colleagues have talked on this bill and had an opportunity to shed some light and some of their concerns, and in light of it, I guess this is going to change, I guess, and from what I get from the bill and the amendments that's being introduced and asked, again, I go back to their situations either happen in the province or people request certain amendments, changes to legislation. And obviously in this legislation, some of my colleagues have referred to some of the challenges that foreign workers, and the challenges that they've been put through, and some of the concerns that, our foreign workers being taken advantage of, and how do we protect them to make sure that they're protected the same way Saskatchewan residents are when it comes to labor standards, occupational health and safety standards, that those individuals that come, and there's many have come in different ways, and I know there's been some programs over the years, and we've heard some of those comments, and sometimes I don't think in the media they've been up. It hasn't always been positive, the way some of the workers were treated. And I guess the government has, introducing this legislation, making amendments, doing what it needs to do to probably to respond to a situation, that's brought to their attention. And that is the role of the government. It's to make sure that whether you're applying through a program to bring foreign workers in, that you follow certain practices so those workers are protected and should be protected. And there are programs out there, and some people apply and they bring over workers. What I believe and my understanding of this legislation is that it would give protection to those workers, and I think hold the individuals who are bringing in foreign workers or hiring them, it makes them accountable, and let's hope that there's enough in this legislation to make sure that workers feel like if there are issues, if they feel like they're being taken advantage of, that they're willing to bring forward their concerns and raise them with the right organizations or individuals when it comes to Saskatchewan labor. And we talk about the standards of the organization that's supposed to look after workers, occupational and health and safety. So we talk about those individuals that have that right to go to those agencies, government agencies, to raise their concerns when they feel like they're not being treated right. And I think some of the stuff, as my colleagues have talked, gives some of that protection to them, and I hope it does. And maybe it's not strong enough, but I guess over time we will tell. They're making some amendments, some changes to make sure that people feel safe. And I think it sends a message out to people who are going through a program and apply. And I know there's different programs, but some of them that apply and they get granted permission to bring in foreign workers. Well, then you're going to be required to follow certain things, and whether there's somebody, and I don't know, and maybe this part of this will be to investigate, to look into it. Maybe there is a process that's going to happen, and that process might already be there. I'm not aware of it, and and maybe we'll find out in committee that there is certain processes that are in place that give that protection to workers, that they can feel like you have a right to work, to be paid a fair wage, to be treated respectful, just like anyone else. There are standards that you as an employee of Saskatchewan and of course of Canada, when you come over here as a worker, there are going to be certain protections to make sure. I could see where maybe someone could take advantage of foreign workers and not treat them the way they should be treated, especially if they don't understand, the process, and I guess if they don't understand it, maybe they're afraid they're going to be sent back home. They won't stay here for whatever reason. So I'm hoping at the end of the day in committee and with my colleagues, we can find out, will this give more protection and send out a message to employers who are going to bring foreign workers into the province, that you are going to have to make sure you adhere to the legislation, the laws, and protections of those workers. And again, my colleagues, like I've said, I went through some of the notes, and some of my colleagues have, expressed, concern and within the media, and talked about some of the challenges that might be the reason why this bill's coming. But I know for ourselves, we'll do the work that we need to do, in committee, and I know there's more of my colleagues will have more questions, and we'll debate the bill, and we'll talk about it and make sure, is it enough? And maybe we can reach out to some of the foreign workers, and I know the critic will do that, finding out what is the best practice, or the best, and maybe some of the challenges, and maybe reach out to some of the employers and the companies that are applying to these programs. is this going to, does this give that protection? Is it enough? Is there any suggestion they can make? And I'm hoping at the end of the day, and that the government does its due diligence, checks with foreign workers, checks with the employers, those that are using the programs, to make sure that it's fair to the employer, but also making sure, as I talked about, Mr. Speaker, that individuals are protected through certain legislation, that those foreign workers have the right to be protected. So we talked about that, and my colleagues have talked about it. I know we'll have more work in committee to do, and I know the critics will have more questions, and I'm prepared, at this time, to adjourn debate on Bill 139. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 139. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Item number 1, Iris. Number what? Number 1. Oh, that's why I can't. Bill number 140. Adjourn debate. Item number 1, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 140, the Animal Health Act. Mr. McCall.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Riversdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to wade into the debate on Bill number 140, the Animal Health Act. Mr. Speaker, this is a bill that, once it is passed, the current bill will be replacing the Diseases of Animals Act, which apparently since 1966, since it was first introduced, has only seen minor revisions. And we know, Mr. Speaker, that lots has changed since 1966. That's a long time for a bill or a person to be on this earth, Mr. Speaker, with only minor revisions. And much has changed since 1966 if we think about the world in which we live, where there's now global travel. Anytime you come into the country now, and when you're leaving, when you're going through customs and you fill out the little customs form and it asks you if you visited a farm in another country. In recent days, Mr. Speaker, that's all about ensuring that we're not transmitting diseases from one part of the world to another, Mr. Speaker. So world travel is something that's changed since 1966, the rate at which we're able to get around the world. Also, we have to think about climate change and the spread of zoonotic diseases. We've got mosquito or insect-borne diseases, but also diseases that have led to outbreaks. We can think about mad cow disease, which there's a variant, Jacob Creutzfeldt disease. So mad cow BSE, which is one and the same. We can think about SARS, which probably had a zoonotic connection from what I've read in the past, Mr. Speaker. So it's a very different world than it was in 1966. So this bill, as the Minister points out in his second reading speech, which is always a good place to start when looking at legislation for the first time, the Minister's and the government's perspective on the bill. The Minister points out that the original bill from 1966 is in fact the second oldest piece of this type of legislation in Canada, and it was good for the time that it served, but times have changed, Mr. Speaker. This new act, the Animal Health Act, contains some of the following provisions. It assigns the authority to prevent, control, and respond to animal disease outbreaks to the province's Chief Veterinary Officer instead of the Minister of Agriculture. The Minister makes the argument that this will allow the province to act quickly when necessary, and it aligns with legislation in most other provinces. He points out that it also gives the Chief Veterinary Officer, instead of the Minister of Agriculture, the authority to add or remove a disease from the list of provincially notifiable diseases. So he points out that if a new and dangerous disease appears in Saskatchewan, it's really important that the province is able to respond quickly and not be weighed down by the requirements of a minister's order. The Minister also points out that the new Act expands the definition of a disease to include non-infectious threats to animal health, such as toxins like lead or ergot, and it also deals with emerging issues such as antimicrobial resistance, which we know is a very real thing both in animal populations but in humans as well, Mr. Speaker, and that is a bit scary when we think about the inability for antibiotics to work for us down the road, Mr. Speaker. The Act sets out veterinary inspectors' authorities and responsibilities with regard to entering and inspecting premises, establishing quarantines, disease surveillance and control zones, and euthanizing animals to prevent suffering or the spread of disease. The minister argues here that this will reduce the threat of legal challenges. It also updates the penalties to make them a greater deterrent. So the fines will be increasing from $500 to a maximum of $25,000, and includes provisions for daily fines for ongoing offences. And he points out that for serious offences, for really serious, in his remarks he says for really serious offences, the term of imprisonment has increased from 6 months to 1 year. And that this lines up with other provinces. I think as someone who doesn't have an agriculture background and is removed from the farm, not far removed, my dad spent some time on the homestead and continued to do some farming with friends even when he'd moved to the city, but I am a generation from that. I would be interested to hear what some of those, in committee it would be interesting to hear what some of those serious offences would include, Mr. Speaker. The minister also points out that the new Act expands the scope of regulations that may be made under its authority to include a range of potential regulatory issues, and the examples he provides would be control of animal diseases, oversight of stray animals, premise identification and traceability, and he says that particular section that does this work will give the Minister of Agriculture potential authority to regulate the dispensing of veterinary drugs in Saskatchewan. So those are some of the things that this bill will do, Mr. Speaker, and when it gets to committee, I know that our critic will have many questions to ask. But one thing that we always like to ask, and what's really important when looking at bills, is to think about consultation and who was involved in requesting the changes. Obviously, a bill that's been around since 1966 with limited changes. It's a good idea to actually review legislation on a regular basis to make sure you're keeping up with the times. So no doubt that it could use some big changes, Mr. Speaker, but it's always important to ask who has requested changes, what kind of consultation, what kind of feedback did people who work in this area get to provide. And I know the minister in his comments says that his ministry spoke to producers through their producer associations as well as the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, the Agricultural Producers Association of Saskatchewan, and that there was input from Ministries of Environment and Health, from the federal government, the relevant colleges at the University of Saskatchewan, veterinarians, and the providers of veterinary services. So it does sound like there was a fair number of folks who were consulted, but it's always good to reach out, and I know the critic responsible for this bill will be talking to stakeholders to find out if they are satisfied with the bill. Did it go far enough? Did it not do some things that they were hoping it would do? So this will be the process in the months to come, Mr. Speaker. He did point out that although there were a few concerns regarding definitions, inspections, and delegated authority, but he says those have been clarified in the legislation or will be addressed in the regulations, and that'll be an opportunity in committee to get a bit better sense about how they will be addressed in regulations. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I know that I have colleagues who will also enter the debate on the Animal Health Act, Bill number 140, as we go along during this legislative session. And with that, I'd like to move to adjourn debate.
Members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 140. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 13. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 142, the Proceedings Against the Crown Act 2018. Ms. Mowat.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Newtana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This new bill is replacing the existing Proceedings Against the Crown Act. This is a modernization, I guess, of sorts. There's a number of changes being made to various wording changes that are really inconsequential, but I guess with drafting rules, they're being reviewed. There's a couple pieces in the existing bill that don't seem to be replaced in the new bill, and I'm a little curious about that and wondering why those have been omitted. And unfortunately, there's nothing in the minister's second reading speech that will tell us what those why those clauses are disappearing. They could be very technical, but just want to put it on the record as something that is interesting and wondering why it's being removed. And in particular, I'm talking about clause 3 sub 1 sub b in the existing act. And in this case, it was an omission of this particular bill from the Proceedings Against the Crown Act, and it was the Succession Duty Act. And I know that succession duties or intestate succession is a matter of importance, but it's not clear to me why that's being omitted from the proposed version of the bill. There's another area that has been omitted, and the minister did talk about this it's being added. There's a new clause in section 14 of the new bill, which does not exist in the original bill, and that's regarding trials without a jury. And the minister did speak to that a little bit in his comments. So that's one of the changes. The other change is a new clause number 20, no judgment by default against the Crown without leave. In proceeding, and that reads, Section 20 reads, in proceeding against the Crown, judgment shall not be entered against the Crown in default of appearance or pleading without the leave of the court to be obtained on motion of which notice has been given to the Crown. So I guess I can't imagine a situation where the Crown wouldn't show up for a trial and not appear and be in default. But I guess maybe it happens, and so this is another protection, I believe, for the Crown in terms of any lawsuits against the Crown. There's a lot of history behind proceedings against the Crown and whether or not you could sue the Queen or the King of the day back in the common law in England. And this is a very time-honored rule of how legislation has replaced the common law. And so this is an example of that, Mr. Speaker. So it's... Oh yeah, one other interesting omission that I really would want to have questions about is in the existing bill. It's the last clause, and it is clause number 23. In the existing bill, it reads, clause 23 reads, this act shall be so interpreted and construed as to affect its general purpose of making uniform the law of the provinces that enact it. And for some reason, the Uniform Construction Clause has been removed from the current bill. So again, more questions because the minister didn't really speak about that in his second reading notes as well. I guess the other interesting thing about this bill is that it's now being written in the 2 official languages of Saskatchewan. We had a bit of discussion about that in question period today, Mr. Speaker, because French is an official language of this country, and certainly these kinds of translations are very important to recognize the law of Canada, and we're seeing sort of a movement of the French. I'm trying to think of the words here, Mr. Speaker, but the office responsible for the Francophonie here in Saskatchewan. I've had the pleasure of being a representative of this assembly for a number of years now with the Association des Parlementaires de la Francophonie, and this is an international organization of parliamentarians that really takes forward the cause of the Francophonie across the world. And as you can imagine, Mr. Speaker, there are a number of countries in the world where French is the official language through the colonization of the 1700s and 1600s and 1800s. And many of these countries are struggling economically and with other social issues, but the fact that the Francophonie can be there to support them. And this organization, the APF, actually does support a lot of the French-speaking countries that aren't as well off as the first world countries, Mr. Speaker. The work of the APF or the APF is, I think, is an incredible part, an important part of the work we do as legislators. And I'm pleased to be able to represent Saskatchewan in that context. Most provinces in Saskatchewan have a full membership in that organization, and I think that's something that our province should continue, or at least look at again, and perhaps restore that membership. And you'll be familiar with that, Mr. Speaker, through some decisions that were made last year. But I think when you look at the role of the Francophonie, not only in Canada, but in Saskatchewan. My mom is a Franc-Saskoise. She grew up speaking French and only learned English when she went to school. There are many, many folks in Saskatoon, I know across the province, whose kids are in French immersion because of the importance of that language and its role in our nation. And so I think it's important for the government of Saskatchewan to reflect the importance of that in the treatment we give the Francophonie here in Saskatchewan. It's not like other languages, it's not like other cultures, Mr. Speaker, because it's one of the founding cultures of the Western world that came to this land. I think it's important to continue to reflect that. There's a vibrant Francophone community here in Saskatchewan, and the law of the land of Canada is important. So again, just happy to see that this law is being translated into French. It's an important effort on the part of our drafters, and certainly hope that this Assembly would continue to give the Francophone community the same sort of respect that they earned through their role here in the Dominion of Canada. At this point, Mr. Speaker, I don't have any further comments on this bill other than those questions that I've raised, so I would move that we adjourn the debate on Bill number 142, an act respecting proceedings against the Crown and making consequential amendments to other acts.
Members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 142. Is it a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 14, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 143, the Proceeds Against the Crown Consequential Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Mowat.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Bill 143 is a very, very short bill that deals with just some consequential amendments, as you can imagine by its name, and these are just to make sure that the change of name from the previous bill I spoke to, the Proceedings Against the Crown Act 2018, will be properly reflected in a number of bills. There's actually a schedule with probably 20 or 30 bills that refer to this bill. So it's merely a consequential amendment. It couldn't be done in the original bill because that one's bilingual, and there was some consequential changes made in Part 6 of Bill 142, those are our Francophone, or bills that are translated into French, and this bill only refers to those that are unilingual in the English language. So there aren't a lot of comments to be made on Bill 143, so at this point I move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 143.
Members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 143. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Agreed.
Government orders, adjourn debate. Item number 15, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 144, the Real Estate Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Chartier.
I recognize the member for Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to join in, make some comments on Bill 144, the Real Estate Amendment Act 2018. Initially, they're setting out the duties or objections of the Saskatchewan Real Estate Commission. They talk about another provision in the Act is providing 1 or 2 members to sit on the commission. It's authorizing those type of appointments, and it's not referring, I think it's going to give, and I don't know for what reason, but they must have had some discussion with I'm assuming the Real Estate Association, and they're going to appoint 1 or 2 members, and maybe as they go through this. There's different things they're going to be doing throughout as the amendment gives certain powers and changes. And it changes the appeal process. They talk about, removing or expanding the amounts from $250,000 to $350,000. It changes the notice for claims to the fund. So there are, and I'll be honest, Mr. Speaker, you know, I don't have much experience when it comes to real estate. But I do know some things, and I'm just going to put some compare that I know, what I understand. I understand in Saskatchewan right now, you know, I think we're 3 times the national average when you look at foreclosures in Saskatchewan. That is a problem. That I can understand and feel for those individuals losing. And it isn't always because of, you know, it's the jobs, people lose their jobs. You know, the government needs to step in and fill those gaps where they can work with industry. And I think about Northern Saskatchewan. I think about the Chemical Corporation and those employees. And I'm just trying to show comparisons. You have many people up there, now that they don't have jobs, you know, they might lose their home. So every time, you know, we have a time where Saskatchewan residents don't do well, the housing market, we know, slows down. And I'll get into a little bit of that. But also, if you're going to have residents losing their homes, not because their job's been gone, they've been let go, the struggles, but we think about the cost, affordability. And I see many families struggling, Mr. Speaker, struggling to make ends meet, keep up the mortgage, keep up all the bills that they have, make sure the kids are dressed to go to school, make sure there's food on the table. Utility bills have been going up. We see all those challenges that many families are struggling with. So you have a real estate industry. You have a real estate industry that is out there trying to, you know, sell homes. And I know that some of them, you know, you've talked to some of them and different people, and my colleagues have. Some of them have done presentations. And I know some of the comments, and I believe some of the market is down, and they talk about, I think, to the lowest it was in 2008, I believe, if I have my facts right. But there were some of those comments about the struggles. So, you know, what is the government doing to help the industry and help the real estate and different things? There are good things government can do. I can tell you one thing that isn't helping the housing market. It's PST on construction, on homes. People are paying PST that this government decided because it needed another $1 billion worth of revenue, so it decided to put PST on pretty well everything. Kids' clothes to right through, like the list went on and on, even on our life insurance, and then they seen the outcry and they reversed that. But I'm just showing about the cost, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the cost that people are feeling and the struggles that they're having and why some would lose their homes. So when I see a government who is making changes, but needs to do more when it comes to our real estate and some of the families that are struggling. And first home owners that want to buy a home, there could be programs that government could do to help people when it comes to purchasing homes. And they like to brag about and pat themselves on the back when they announce a certain thing. But let me be very clear, Mr. Deputy Speaker. There are many families struggling. And there are families working 2 and 3 jobs. We've heard about that. They share the story how they struggle. So when you have an opportunity of a government, when it's changing bills, and you know, why don't they come up with programs? And I was hoping we'd see some of the programs, you know, some of the, so that, you know, you'd have more affordability for people who are struggling. And isn't that what a government should do when people are struggling? But no, this government put a lot of hardship on many family residents. And I talk about the PST in many different areas, just showing it as an example when it comes to housing. How the PST on construction has affected the markets and has challenges. And I'm sure the real estate companies will say this does not help their industry. So when a government makes programs and changes to help the industry, that's a good thing. People to buy homes. So those in the construction business, they build them, and then the real estate company, they sell them. That's my understanding of it. And like I said, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm not an expert at it, and I know that my colleagues will reach out, and you've had different people present different times. I've heard to those that are in the industry. They're struggling too, you know, to make. I've seen so many homes on the market. I think back home, you know, I think there's 113, 120 homes at any given time. Where I come from, on the market, people are struggling, and some are leaving, and they're having to lose. And I guess, you know, that takes me back to some of these houses that are there. We used to have a government office. It's a Mestastic building in La Ronge. It employed lots of government employees. But we've seen as government things changed over time. They got rid of, they decentralized, they said, oh, those jobs will go down south, they're here and there, or they just cut them all together. So those were good paying government jobs. Those homes, people could have buy those homes that were there in La Ronge and Air Ronge and the surrounding area, and they could live there. They provide for their family. They were good paying government jobs. But this government, made its decision. So I'm just trying to show how those decisions of a government affect markets in the real estate in certain areas, and those challenges that many of the real estate companies are feeling. And those salespeople, they're doing the great work they can do, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but unfortunately, when a government makes more hurdles than helps them, why do you want to pat yourself on the back as a government? I think you might want to reverse it and say, how can we help the industry? How can we help people with utilities? How do we help you stay in your home? How can we do that? What programs could we do to help those? So I know there's changes that they're making, and they're proposing these changes, and at the end of the day, hopefully, and the markets will improve, jobs. The government will do a better job on supporting industry and companies, Mr. Deputy Speaker, so that there is, good employment and people wanting to buy homes, so the real estate industry can feel that. So I just kind of wanted to go and just show some comparisons and some of the things that may have affected some of the markets. I know interest rates will affect the markets. We know that. Government changes and programs, regulations can affect that. I'm sure they can, and if you ask that the industry out there, they probably would say that. Yes, any regulations could impact them. Interest rates could impact the house sales. But government can also impact it, and government can cause, I think, more hardship when it puts the PST on construction of homes and everything. It just adds further cost to families trying to make ends meet. So I know I went on a little bit, but I just wanted to show that comparisons, because there are struggles out there that people are struggling, and we're good paying jobs in the north, in La Ronge and area, and also in other northern communities. I know we talked about that, and my colleague from Athabasca talked about that in his thing, talking about the correction center in Buffalo Narrows and places like that where they were shut down. So you see those challenges. So that creates people struggling, and again, more foreclosures, as we said. I think we're 3 times the national average. So that should wake up the government to say, what are we doing wrong? What can we do to help people? So with that, Mr. Speaker, I don't have much more comments at that time. I know my colleagues will have an opportunity to say more. Committee will do the work that needs to be done in there. So at this point, I'm prepared to adjourn on Bill 144, the Real Estate Amendment Act 2018. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Cumberland has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 144, the Real Estate Amendment Act 2018. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourn debates, item number 12, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 145, the Residential Services Act 2018. Mr. McCall.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise and enter into the debate on Bill number 145, an act respecting facilities that provide certain residential services and to make consequential amendments to other acts. And this is a very important piece of legislation before us. And I know that when we get into committee that we'll have lots of good questions, and we look forward to the Minister answering them in a meaningful and straightforward way. But in the meantime, I do want to, we'll be contacting stakeholders and people who have an interest in this kind of legislation, see what their thoughts are, what their hopes, what their worries are. It is interesting, the Minister of Social Services put this forward, and when he was talking about it, he said that this is something that hasn't been changed in some 30 years, and in fact that it goes quite a ways back, and in fact that's why we don't have any explanatory notes that go along with it, because it's a brand new act. So forgive me if I'm making comments, and some notes would help me out, but there are no notes, so we're just going to wing it right now, and we'll have to do our research over the winter break. But at the meantime, I do want to say that he does talk about, and I understand that this is really directed at the very vulnerable people in our province, who need residential services and will be dependent and trusting of their caregivers, the folks who run these facilities, to make sure they are following the intent of the law, and that we do have appropriate oversight. But, Mr. Speaker, it is something that we have raised many, many times in terms of whether it's seniors and senior homes, that type of thing, that we don't have standards of care, and this is very important. So I'll be looking forward to knowing more about this. But he talks about, and I'm just going to quote here for the folks at home, because this is important. This governs the facilities that provide residential services to some of Saskatchewan's most vulnerable people. Many of these people are not able to independently care for themselves due to family circumstance, age, disability, and illness. People requiring residential services might receive care in group homes, approved private service homes, domestic violence shelters, and community-based homes. The Residential Services Act was last reviewed in 1985 and have had no substantial amendments at that time. So, Mr. Speaker, Deputy Speaker, it really appears that we're really talking about, in many ways, group homes that might be run by community-based organizations, the CBOs, that do the good work in our communities. Some might be privately run, and I know that in many cases the budgets are very, very tight, and we need to make sure that these are appropriately funded. And of course, as we have seen in the past years, that in fact we're going more and more to seeing the group homes in terms of whether it's youth at risk, particularly I know some in Saskatoon, with some of the programs there. For example, EGADS has a number of group homes for youth. That's an issue. We'll be interested to hear what folks like those people have to say. We also know that we've seen in terms of Moose Jaw, the Valley View Centre now, the operations are being wound down, and many of those folks are now potentially in group homes. And so what are the implications for that? And so so there's a lot of more, and I don't know if this is the case or not, but and maybe it's something that we've become more aware of, but there seems to be more of this than there were before. I don't know if that's the case, and that would be a good question to ask in terms of the last number of years. How many group homes are there? How many people are we actually talking about? What are their circumstances? And what can we learn more about that? That's very, very important, because as we know, and you know, the other one, we've talked about domestic violence shelters. Who all would qualify for that? Unfortunately, that's an area that has seen a lot of attention, and rightly so, because that's something that we want to make sure we have the appropriate supports for victims who are fleeing domestic violence, and we want to make sure that those shelters are funded appropriately. We did have that tragic situation a few years ago where the fire in Melfort, I believe, burnt down the the shelter there, and then was rebuilt. So we want to make sure that those things are looked after, and that they're all well in hand. I do want to talk just a brief moment here that, and I don't know, again, this is the part where I say I don't know whether this is a repeat from 1985 or an introduction of a new part, and this will be one that we'll look. The minister did not highlight this part, but he goes on, and I should just say this for right now. He said the most substantial differences between the current act and the rewrite include the expansion of types of homes. So that's just what I refer to, that we're seeing more homes covered by this act, and that's very important. and the current legislation has strict and limited definitions, and now that's become more flexible. Government has growing need to expand residential options for people with different abilities, children in need of protection, women and children fleeing interpersonal violence, and talks about that. And then talks about penalties being increased. And in addition, he talks about the including the maximum length of which the license can be issued. So as I look through this, and then talks about fire inspections, that's relatively straightforward. And as I said, that tragic circumstance in Melfort with the fire in the shelter. I don't know if it was actually occupied at the time, but and then talks about, he does say, the ability for an applicant to request a review of decisions regarding licenses. It clearly outlines provisions for the protection of residents, protection for persons who report abuse, and appoint an administrator to act in the place of an operator. And that's very important because we do see, and as I talked about, the money can be very tight for these folks. And if the situation does arise that you've got a group home that's operating really well, but the CBO or the organization does go bankrupt, what do? You can't put all the people who are living there on the street, and somebody has to take over the management for whatever reason that may arise, and I think that's important. But I do want to just talk just a brief moment. I think this is very key, and this has been raised to me as an issue in terms of protection of residents, Part 4, Section 15. And this is when talking about abuse. And I just want to take a minute to reflect on this and go to those pages, because this is very important. It talks about what the definition is, and that could be physical, sexual, emotional, or psychological abuse, verbal abuse, financial abuse, neglect, any other prescribed form of abuse. So I assume that might come up in regulations. And so there is a process for reporting the abuse that the operator or any employee or agent who has reasonable grounds to believe that there is abuse involving a resident within a care facility shall report that abuse as soon as is reasonably possible to the minister or a person designated by the minister. So I hope that is relatively straightforward. And it's not a may clause, it's a shall clause. You shall report the abuse if you know of the report or the abuse happening, because we are talking about people who are vulnerable. And if they are being abused under any of these circumstances, and that can't be tolerated, cannot be tolerated at all. And so that report needs to move ahead, and that's very important. And then there is a section, the next section, protection for persons who do report, that no action or other proceeding lies or shall be commenced against the person who reports abuse pursuant to this part, if the report is made in good faith. And that's always a good caveat. But the fact of the matter is that, that we need to ensure that our facilities or residential services, such as these, for vulnerable people, are safe, and family or friends have the confidence and the trust in the facility that their loved ones or the ones who are near and dear to them are safe and will be looked after. So, Mr. Speaker, as I said, I know that our folks who are the critics in this area, and we'll be talking to people who have a stake in these type of situations, will be looking very closely. So with that, I'll be wrapping up my comments in a few short moments here, but I just want to make sure that I got those comments on record, because they're pretty important, that we take a look and see how do we protect people. And so with that, Mr. Speaker, I would like to adjourn Bill number 145, an act respecting facilities that provide certain residential services to make consequential amendments to other acts. I do so move adjournment. Thank you.
The member from Saskatoon Centre has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 145. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Item number 10, resume debate on the second reading motion of Bill number 147, the Oil and Gas Conservation Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Sproul.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise today to enter into debate on Bill number 147, the Oil and Gas Conservation Amendment Act 2018. There's quite a few things that this Amendment Act proposes to do. It changes some terms that were used in previous legislation and adds new ones. It redefines the role and responsibilities of the minister. It sets new rules for inspection and investigation of incidents, sets out the proceedings governing the pooling interests in drainage unit and drainage area, changes the procedures governing a pooling order. It adds a new clause on the reduction of greenhouse gases and changes the penalty provisions, expanding the fees to $50,000 for an individual and $500,000 to a corporation per day of offense. So let's look at what some of the changes are that are being proposed in this act. I always think it's useful to look at what the minister has to say in their second reading speech. So we'll do that here first, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And she says that some of the most significant changes are being made in support of the Prairie Resilience Strategy, and that they will help both the Ministry of Energy and Resources and the Ministry of Environment move forward with this strategy, because of course it relies on both ministries to be able to perform some sort of regulation in this area. And this is talking about developing regulations which will aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It is, I will say that it is encouraging, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to see a strategy that's being described as a results-based process. And it's nice that we're seeing a focus on outcomes coming from this ministry. We know that in many cases, this government likes to talk about inputs. We've put the following into this ministry, we've put the following into this program, we've put the following dollars into this program, therefore it should be successful. But we have had a strong emphasis on outcomes on this side of the House, and we believe that that is where we should remain focused in being evidence-based and making sure that our policies are working in the way that we want them to work. So we will be watching closely to monitor, to ensure that that there is a reduction in greenhouse gases according to what the ministry desires, and would like to see that a results-based approach exists elsewhere within other ministries as well. So having a look at what some of the changes are that are being proposed here, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there are a significant number of changes, many housekeeping in nature, and many of them are reflective of changes in the industry. Of course, the industry changes over time, and we need to make changes in the Act that reflect this. There are also some new definitions that are being proposed. Section 6 is removed. There are some changes around Section 7.9, where the Oil and Gas Conservation Board is immune from liability, so that's an important change, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Section 17, this takes into account the fact that there's reference to the minister being an inspector, reference to the fact that an inspector would be involved rather than the minister, as to reflect the fact that the minister doesn't do the inspections herself. And then certainly there's some really important changes to this bill as it reflects the emission strategy with greenhouse gases. So there's a whole new part 7.1 that is being introduced, and this looks like it's an effort to create a regulatory sphere for the role of the Ministry of Energy and Resources to deal with emissions coming out of upstream oil and gas. So it's worth noting the fact that we're talking about a split in the regulatory authority, and it's difficult here to make incisive comments about what this will result in, because we haven't seen a firm plan in terms of what those regulations are going to look like. So we can't make full comment on that, and I know that the critic is going to have a ton of questions in committee that will be able to really draw out what these regulations are going to look like, and how this is going to function in terms of what the logistics are, Mr. Deputy Speaker. When we talk about what some of the other pieces are here, what some of the other clauses, there's a vague new clause that's being added, 53.61 subsection 2, that the minister may use any indicators that the minister considers relevant in the preparation of a report. This is quite a vague reference, so it's unclear what is going to be included in this. So we certainly have questions in terms of what the regulation is going to look like. Section 53.64 allows the minister to enter into agreements on behalf of the government, but the minister will need approval from the Lieutenant Governor and Council. So on one hand, it's good that there's checks and balances to the minister, but on the other hand, it's delegating authority to the minister in there as well. A few other changes. We mentioned the clause about penalties increasing already. So that's an overview of what some of the main changes are, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And certainly when it comes to oil and gas, we believe that there needs to be stronger regulations that make sure that we are protecting our environment and reflect our strict commitment to the reduction of greenhouse gases emissions. We're definitely going to be asking a lot of questions in committee about how this legislation will be enforced alongside Bill 132, which is the Management and Reduction of Greenhouse Gases Act, because we know that these two go hand in hand in terms of how the reduction is actually going to take place. And actually, if we look at the last Provincial Auditor's Report, 2018 report, Volume 1, I think this came out in June, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there are a couple of chapters that relate to this, this legislation, but notably Chapter 4, Energy and Resources Regulating Oil, Gas and Pipeline Industry Incidents. There are a number of recommendations that are made in this report that we can see on page 43 of this report. In section 4.1, there's a table that outlines the fact that the number of industry operators reporting incidents has significantly declined. So that sounds like a good thing, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but when we look at the fact that there were in 2012-2013, there were a total of 847 coming in from 4 different field office locations. There were a total of 847 incidents reported to the ministry, and then moving to 2016-2017, there were 657. So we're seeing a reduction in the number of incidents that have been reported. That can look like a good thing, but there's also a question around what the culture of reporting incidents is, and whether whether there are incidents that are going unreported as well. So there's a couple of different perspectives that we should be looking at there. And we certainly are asking what the government's doing to enforce the reporting of incidents. And then there are some recommendations that have been made by the provincial auditor as it relates to oil and gas here as well. So the first new recommendation that came out in this report, again, just this past spring, is on page 48 of the provincial auditor's report. Recommendation number 1, we recommend that the Ministry of Energy and Resources document its classification of risk of reported incidents in relation to oil and gas wells, facilities, pipelines, and flow lines, and its inspections on the nature and timing of ministry involvement. And we know that, as is indicated in Chapter 4, in March 2018, the ministry had started to develop a process to guide initial responses to reported incidents, but we haven't seen whether that process has been completed. On page 51 of the auditor's report, the second new recommendation is made. We recommend that the Ministry of Energy and Resources set expectations for documenting key activities for regulating reported incidents of spills and other incidents relating to oil and gas wells, facilities, pipelines, and flow lines. So in terms of being able to standardize what documentation exists is crucial in terms of tracking and making sure that the government is doing its part to enforce reporting of incidents. Because without this information, of course, Mr. Deputy Speaker, if we don't have accurate information on this front, it's very difficult for us to be able to get a picture of what is happening with upstream oil and gas as an industry. So I think that it's worth looking at what these recommendations are, and I certainly hope that the minister has had a chance to go through this and that the ministry is working diligently as I stand here today and speak on these issues because we know that they are of central importance, and we need to make sure that we have strong regulations and stronger regulations that do work to protect our environment here. I will say that because of the complexities of this legislation, we know that the critic is going to be going through it very closely, and we'll be looking as well at how it interacts with Bill 132 and making sure that the regulations are put in place in a way that is going to be able to ensure that we are reducing our emissions. But with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would move that we, for today at least, adjourn debate on Bill number 147, the Oil and Gas Conservation Amendment Act 2018.
The member from Saskatoon Fairview has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 147. Is it pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourn debates item number 11. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 148, the Pipelines Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Sproul.
I recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's my honor to rise this afternoon and enter into the debate around Bill number 148, an act to amend the Pipelines Act. This act does a few things of importance that I think I will be highlighting this afternoon. And I just want to go over what this act is actually doing in terms of its legislative changes. Subsection 22 sub 3 will provide the minister with authority to acquire pipeline and flow line survey plans directly from the person that carried out the original survey. It also gives the minister authority in subsection 22 sub 4 to pay reasonable costs for acquiring that survey information, Mr. Deputy Speaker, which I understand will be a bit of a change from the legislation as it was written previously. There will also be a new clause 25 sub 1 T.1, which will align the regulation making authorities for the administrative penalties under the Act to those found in the Oil and Gas Conservation Act. So it'll allow for similar regulation powers that we already see in the other legislation. And then there's also subsection 25.2 sub 1, which is amended to provide authority to establish technical directives for the operation of the electronic license registry in relation to the regulation making authorities found in section 30.4. Section 25.2 sub 3 will be amended to allow additional means of public notice in the event that the website is not available. Subsection 25.2 sub 4 will be amended to include regulations made pursuant to proposed section 30.4, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It also creates an entirely new part to the legislation, which is Part 6, which is called the Electronic License Registry, and that's being added to clarify some definitions that apply to that electronic license registry that I understand already exists. So it'll define the terms that are applied to that registry and set out the application of the part for the registry. It also clarifies and establishes this registry and sets out the rules that will be in place concerning its use. It will enable the minister to establish those requirements, those rules and procedures related to the operation of the electronic license registry, so the minister may make additional rules or changes as needed rather than having to go through the legislative process again. It also will enable the registration of legacy licenses on the date the new system is implemented and to continue those licenses on their current term. This new part will also establish requirements for registering pipeline licenses and authorizes the minister to restrict or prohibit the access to the electronic license registry where there's a contravention of the Act regulations and any applicable directive. It will also provide the minister with the power to delete and correct entry in accordance with the regulations when the affected licenses are noticed, and establishes information establishes that the information that's found in the registry will prevail. Furthermore, it establishes a mechanism to allow for the continued issuance of licenses in the event of the electronic license registry becomes no longer functional, and provides the authority to establish regulations for the implementation of the electronic license registry. Mr. Deputy Speaker, essentially this bill will authorize the minister to obtain pipeline and flow line survey plans, like I had said earlier, directly from the person who carried out the original survey. It's one of the main changes in this bill. It also allows for the use of administrative penalties to sanction a failure to comply with the requirements of the regulation, which is very important, especially when we're talking about the importance of this industry and the importance to ensure that there's compliance with respect to the regulations in this industry. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I know quite a few of my colleagues are going to have more they're going to want to add to this debate. So in order to facilitate that discussion, I will adjourn debate on Bill number 148.
The member from Regina Douglas Park has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 148, the Pipelines Amendment Act 2018. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion.
Adjourn debates item number 16. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 149, the Police Regional Policing Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Belanger.
I recognize the member from Prince Albert, Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to stand today to add some of my remarks with regards to Bill 149, the Police Regional Policing Amendment Act. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this isn't an area of my expertise, and so I did a little bit of research prior to standing here today to do putting some of my remarks. My understanding is that the changes with regards to this bill was indeed a promise that was delivered within the throne speech, and so we were expecting that this legislation was going to follow through. Part of this legislation is to allow communities that have a population of under 500 to participate in regional police services. So this would be villages, hamlets, RMs are able to, my understanding is that the previous language in this bill indicated that it would be 2 larger urban centers and then potentially a RM that could participate in the regional policing services, but with this change in legislation, any community can participate in it, and with some discussion that I was reading about, potentially a couple RMs might partner up with each other to have their own regional police services, but and also doing some information gathering about regional policing services. My understanding from what I researched was that a lot of these regional police services are more common in Eastern Canada, and they oftentimes were connected to a larger center. And so we know in Eastern Canada they have larger urban centers there and a higher population, and so collecting resources is a bit easier with regards to those communities because they have, with the larger populations, they have more availability to funding. So this is going to be a bit of a challenge in a province like Saskatchewan that our population, the majority of our population is in our largest urban centers, and then we have a whole bunch of smaller communities within a large geographic area. So that's going to present a bit of a challenge. The changes to this legislation are aimed to address rural crime, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and we've been hearing more about the issues with rural crime in our communities, and so we had a caucus committee on rural crime go to communities to talk to stakeholders. That's what their intention was supposed to be, in with regards to how they could put some resources in these communities to address the crime rates. And one of the issues I had, Mr. Deputy Speaker, with this partisan caucus committee was that it was completely partisan. Oftentimes when we've had committees going through the province to talk to communities or stakeholders with regards to an issue that that as a government they wanted to look at, like organ donation, or there was drinking and driving, I believe was one that I could think of, that they had members from both sides of the House participating in that. And so I was very disappointed when this was completely government members that were participating in this caucus committee on rural crime. The also issue I had with regards to this, Mr. Deputy Speaker, was that I heard, as when I was previously the municipal relations critic, and municipal leaders indicated that they asked to meet with the committee and were denied. And so I don't know exactly what their criteria of setting up meetings were, but I would think that meeting with municipal leaders would have been top of that criteria, because who would know the crime issues within their community more than municipal leaders. And another issue I had as well is when this particular committee came to my community, I asked if I could just sit in as completely as an advisor, because I think it's really important for me to also, even though I'm sitting on this side of the House, to know what the issues are in our community, because we were all elected for this position, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and we're supposed to represent our communities as best as we can. And I asked if I could sit in on that committee, and I was denied also. So it was very closed. It wasn't open to many people. They didn't do any open community groups as well, and it was selected individuals who had appointments to meet with that committee. So I wonder if the recommendations were presented that are truly going to be representative of those communities. It's hard to tell. So getting back to the changes with regards to this piece of legislation, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is that there's a lot of questions with regards to this legislation, and one of them is the funding. How is this new policing structure going to be funded, Mr. Deputy Speaker? There's no indication on how that will be. From some of the media information I noticed was that there was no indication that there was going to be additional provincial funding to help establish these regional policing services, and so there was no commitment for funds from this province. And also, what will the cost sharing look like? I would expect that is going to be needed. We know that this government has been downloading on municipalities the last few budgets, you know, and so is this going to be another further downloading on municipalities with regards to funding this police service? They want to take all the credit, but yet they make these municipalities pay for it. The other issue that there is that is there going to be more resources added? Because we know that if we're going to be expecting some of the larger urban centres to provide some of these policing services, that they're already busy and they already can't put more on their plate. So are there going to be more resources allocated for that, Mr. Deputy Speaker? And also, we know that taxes paid for policing in the larger urban centres is quite substantially higher than taxes paid for policing services in smaller communities. And so there is a bigger expectation for these taxpayers who are paying more to have more access to services. And so will the taxes for the individuals wanting more services in these smaller communities, is that going to be reflective of what the service expectation is, and will that increase? So again, I guess that would be based on what municipalities would have to decide, and the amount of funding that they're going to have to put forward, and they might have to put that forward to the taxpayer base to be able to afford that. So, like I said before, a lot of these Eastern Canadian centres that have regional police services, they utilize the larger urban centres to provide this regional service, and so in this province, I was thinking that might be a direction that they may go. I know in the Prince Albert area that's been discussed about having our municipal policing service providing more services around our regional area, so outside the city limits into some of the RMs. And but there would be fully an expectation that those communities that are being serviced would help provide for that service, but then we're also going to need more officers, because we can't have less services for the urban centre because they're expanding their geographic area of providing service. So I also was looking to see if there was really a good description of what this regional policing service was going to look like, and so I don't know, I couldn't find anything myself, but I'm sure the critic who has a better understanding of this will maybe be more fortunate and able to do that. But will this be to enforce just provincial statutes, while the RCMP will still handle the criminal matters? Or would this regional policing service be expected to handle the criminal matters? So I guess that's something that is also going to need to be discussed once this particular piece of legislation goes to committee. Also, who's going to be responsible for training the individuals that are in this regional policing service? I saw some interviews with Reeves of RMs that said that they may hire an individual in their area to do some policing aspect, but what training is going to be provided? Is there going to be something maybe expanded provincially, so that when these regions want to hire someone, that they can get their training from those facilities? That would be something I think that needs to be looked into. And who will be responsible for regulating these services? Will these regional policing services, would there be a board connected to it? Will it be the local elected officials who will be overseeing it? And if that's in fact the case, who will have the experience on that board to understand policing and the issues that are involved with that, and the specialized services that they provide, and ensure that that's being conducted in a professional manner, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So when the Minister presented this piece of legislation in the House and was interviewed by the media, she indicated that this act will provide an opportunity to explore the better focus on rural residents and the new policing models. So the new policing models, I had a lot of questions with regards to that wording. Is this expanding into more? What kind of models are they talking about? You know, and so I think these will be really good questions to ask in committee with regards to what's the full intentions of the changes in this legislation, and is there some changes that will be more immediate, or will there be ongoing changes, and how will that look? Again, Mr. Deputy Speaker, when we look at addressing crime, it's really important that we look at the root causes of crime. I think us neglecting to look at the root causes of crime is neglectful. So we got to keep in mind that if we want to address crime, we have to address poverty, we have to address addictions, and we're talking with police forces across this province. They indicated that crystal meth is a huge issue, especially with regards to the increase of property crime, which I believe is the one issue for rural municipalities right now, and rural crime. And so we need to have a comprehensive strategy for addressing crystal meth within this province, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So I think it's really important that we take that into account when we're talking about rural crime, and we can't just simply rely on having more policing services, even though that's an important factor as well. So, like I said, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I know I have other colleagues that will have a lot that they'll want to put on the record with regards to discussion of this piece of legislation, and I know the critic will meet with stakeholders and be well prepared when it comes to committee with discussion. So with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm going to adjourn debate on Bill number 149. Thank you.
The member from Prince Albert North Dakota has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 149, the Police Regional Policing Amendment Act 2018. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates, item number 17, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 150, the Seizure of Criminal Property Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Belanger.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter into debate today on Bill number 150, the Seizure of Criminal Property Amendment Act 2018. I do have a couple of comments that I want to add to the record here after reviewing the proposed amendments here. But a quick summary of what the bill proposes to do. It sets out that the defendant or respondent waive their rights to an interest in a property that is found to be in the proceeds of unlawful activity where that person fails to take part in proceedings under the Act. So essentially we're talking about criminals or those who are alleged criminals and the proceeds of crime being taken away from them. So this could be actual cash, but it could also be the it could be equipment that was used in the criminal activity or the alleged criminal activity, such as cameras, vehicles, etc. So it describes the process under which this takes place. It allows the director to publish online a notice of administrative forfeiture proceedings against a seized property. And on the 10th day, if the person having an interest in the property does not respond to the notice, this one is deemed to be served. So it's talking about a process of posting that notice online and the alleged criminal being responsible for finding that. Extends the rebuttal presumption to apply to applications for interim orders under the Act. Proof that a property subject to forfeiture proceedings is associated with unlawful activity will include the following evidence: property previously subject to a community safety order, vehicle associated with impaired driving offense, restricted or prohibited firearm used in gang activity, and evidence that sexual offenses occurred on or in the property. It allows the director to collect information from other sources in addition to local authorities and government institutions, and extends the agreements with other jurisdictions respecting the forfeiture of property and sharing of that property. There are some questions that we have on this side about the fact that the property seizure takes place as soon as the alleged criminal is arrested. So there are obviously some complications with the fact that we are presuming that they're guilty in that situation. So the fact of when the property is seized becomes a question. Do we know if it was too hard to seize property before these changes took place? And I don't necessarily think that we've been hearing that from folks. Is there any evidence that this action will deter crime? I think the whole intent behind it is to be a deterrent. However, there's no evidence that this type of activity will actually serve to deter crime. And of course, you don't have to be convicted of the crime. So there are definitely some questions that we have about this, and the critic will have more questions in committee. And an interesting piece around all of this looks at the amount of money that has been collected by the province as a result of seizing criminal property. And we know that number has went down. In 2017, 2018, there were 141 forfeitures, totaling $882,000. When you compare that to and in 2016, 2017, there were only 121, but it totaled $1.5 million. So I think there's definitely a question. It makes you wonder about the fact that they're seizing more property, but they're getting less money as a result, and wonder about why this expansion is taking place, and if there's any kind of if there's any reason behind this. I will let my fellow colleagues weigh in further and look forward to what the critic has to say in committee. But with that, I would like to move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 150. Mr. Deputy Speaker.
The member from Saskatoon Fairview has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 150. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates, item number 18, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 151, the Personal Property Security Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Belanger.
I recognize the member from Anna.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to address this bill. I think the minister gave some fairly clear direction of where this is coming from, and there's some basically updating that's happening on the bill. In particular, when you think of personal property security, back in the day before computers and before banking was done online, there's been a significant number of changes, and I think that's simply what this bill is trying to do, is to update to reflect current technology when it comes to electronic funds. And so, as he said in his speech just recently, I think it was just yesterday, what day is it? Yes, yesterday he talked about addressing issues like electronic chattel paper, payments of debts and transfer of negotiable property by electronic funds transfer, revised conflicts of law provisions, and technical and legal language improvements to the Act to facilitate operation of the secured lending provisions in the Act. Mr. Speaker, he also talked about the leadership of Professor Ron Cumming, and Ron Cumming is a leading academic across Canada when it comes to personal property security and the registries that have been established to manage those securities. So I can be sure that if Ron Cumming had a hand in this, that it's well done and will be entirely appropriate. It's highly technical, and so without going into great detail today, I think we're going to need to take a look at some of the changes, and certainly would hope that Professor Cumming and the Canadian Conference on Personal Property Security Law will continue to be involved in the discussions, and the Minister has indicated that that is exactly the case. So I think we're going to have to take a closer look at the material in the bill, but there's a number of changes that are being proposed. Procedures are going to be observed for control of electronic records. The purpose of purchase money security interest and inventory sets out general rules determining the validity of interest by the law of the jurisdiction in which the collateral is situated. And as you know, Mr. Speaker, many of these things will change property or provincial boundaries like a vehicle. It could easily end up anywhere in the country, even though the security would be established in Saskatchewan for the payments. It's providing for a process to continue out-of-province perfection of goods that are relocated here in Saskatchewan, clarifies perfection rules where goods are removed from one jurisdiction to another, and sets out rules where to determine where a debtor is located for the purpose of conflict rules. So as you can imagine, in the mobility world that we live in, where people are often traveling back and forth, these kinds of security rules where we have cooperation with other provinces is very important. And then it establishes another of other updates, Mr. Speaker, so I will look forward to continuing debate on this as we move it through the process, but at this point I will move to amend or adjourn the debate on Bill number 151, the Personal Property Security Amendment Act 2018.
The member from Saskatoon-Sutherland has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 151, the Personal Property Security Amendment Act 2018. Is it pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourned debates, item number 9. Resume debate and second reading motion on Bill number 141, the Interpersonal Violence Disclosure Protocol Clare's Law Act. Mr. Forbes.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon-Riversdale.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter debate here today on Bill number 141, an act respecting the disclosure of certain information in accordance with an Interpersonal Violence Disclosure Protocol 2018. So some of these things, what this bill will aim to do, Mr. Speaker, it is based on Clare's Law in the United Kingdom, and it was introduced in honor, or in the UK it was named in honor of Claire Wood, who was murdered by her partner and was unaware of his violent past. Claire's father had fought for this law and for more disclosure by police to protect victims of interpersonal or intimate partner violence, Mr. Speaker. So this particular piece of legislation here in Saskatchewan will establish a statutory framework for police services here in the province to disclose such relevant information about someone's violent or abusive past to intimate partners who may be at risk. The Minister says if we're able to identify such risk and inform those at risk how best to manage and respond to that risk, then tragedies may be avoided, Mr. Speaker. And there are many tragedies here in Saskatchewan. We have a very high rate of interpersonal or intimate partner violence here, and it is an important piece of legislation, but it is by no means
all we should be doing here in this regard. This time last year, actually, Mr. Speaker, the government did finally move on my colleague's private member's bill and implemented 10 days of unpaid leave for intimate partner violence. But the trend across Canada and elsewhere is to ensure that victims have the opportunity to have some paid days as well. And I know that my colleague was advocating for 5, and our caucus, and many others have been advocating for 5 paid days, Mr. Speaker. Just looking at some of why this is important, Barb McQuarrie, who was quoted in a Global News article last year, Mr. Speaker, she is at Western University with the Centre for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. And her point, she says, making sure that leave is paid is really important for some survivors. Economic autonomy, economic independence is that factor that determines whether they can stay or whether they can leave. Others point out that dealing with violence is time-consuming, Mr. Speaker. This means that if you can't miss work or if you can't afford to miss work, missing court, missing counselling appointments at a really critical time will have an impact on the outcome of your ability to navigate leaving that relationship and establishing a new start for you and your children, Mr. Speaker. Women need to find housing. They need to meet with lawyers, meet with the police. They need to open up bank accounts. None of this magically happens on its own, and it also usually happens during business hours. So the need for paid days is really important, Mr. Speaker. We can look to places, actually in New Zealand, they do in fact have 10 paid days. We have and that's been heralded as incredibly positive. I think in the Philippines as well they have 10 paid days. Manitoba and Ontario are 2 provinces that provide 5 paid days. Again, the paid piece is really important. Job protection is too, and I'm not negating the importance for job protection, and I know, again, my colleague from Douglas Park advocated, we've advocated for longer unpaid days than 10, I think up to 17 weeks. Other jurisdictions have done that to ensure you can keep your employment but still manage to deal with the fallout from intimate partner violence. So although Bill 141 is important and it allows a local police service to provide that disclosure information about an abusive partner to a person who's at risk of interpersonal violence, and it outlines a class of persons who may assist or make an application on behalf of the applicant, and it sets out the obligation for the person receiving the disclosure information to keep it confidential. It's one small step. Again, I think it's easy I'm not going to diminish the value of this piece of legislation, but it's going to take a lot more to address our high rates of intimate partner violence and support those who have lived through it, Mr. Speaker, to successfully get established on the other side of leaving one of these relationships. I just have to point out that in the minister's media, when they passed the legislation, when we passed the legislation, both sides of the House, for 10 unpaid days, the minister was asked in the media, why no paid days? Why aren't you going with the 5 paid days? And he had commented that stakeholders had told him that businesses would be reluctant to hire women if that was the case. And forgive me for saying this, but I think it's an incredibly outdated attitude, Mr. Speaker. I can hearken back to even my oldest daughter is 20 years old, and back in that day, maternity leave was only 6 months long. Wasn't long after, I think the year later, that it became a year. But and I know women, it wasn't very many years before that women and men didn't have access to either maternity leave or parental leave, job protection, and those benefits that come from EI through that. And I can remember actually being a young woman and hearing comments around employers not wanting to hire women because women will be off to deliver, to go have children. And this is 2018, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and we should be far beyond those attitudes. We should be recognizing the value that everybody has in the workplace, and I think it's up to government to lead. And I think employers actually may see the benefits. When you support your employees, whether it's maternity and parental leave or paternity leave, compassionate leave, interpersonal violence or intimate partner violence, actually I think the outcome would illustrate that you have greater recruitment and retention of employees in the long haul, reduced absentee rates, greater commitment to the workplace when you know you're protected. And how incredibly difficult it would be to have to come to work because you need the paycheck, Mr. Speaker, but your mind just isn't in the game and it isn't at the workplace if you recognize you're missing court or you should be in counseling instead. There are great benefits that can come to employers too by supporting its employees around some of these issues, Mr. Speaker. So with Bill number 141, I know when it gets to committee that our justice critic will have many questions to ask, and I'm sure the conversation about 5 paid days will come up again. In fact, actually, the federal government just passed or just introduced legislation on job protection, or pardon me, 5 paid days for federally regulated employees, of which there are I don't know, I can't recall the exact number, Mr. Speaker, but obviously most employees in Canada fall under provincial regulation. So it's great for federal employees, whether it's in transportation or the RCMP, certain areas, but unfortunately, if you don't live in a province that has paid days like Manitoba and Ontario, up to 5 there, it doesn't serve, I think, its citizens well. But with that, Mr. Speaker, for Bill number 141, for now, I'd like to move to adjourn debate.
The member from Saskatoon and Riversdale has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 141. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move that this House do now adjourn.
The Government House Leader has moved that this House adjourns. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. That's carried. This House stands adjourned until tomorrow at 1:30 p.m.